Chapter 395. In terms of the word-of-mouth of Thriller, because the viewpoints expressed in the movie were very unfavorable, the critics did not have a very high evaluation. They only expressed praise for the exciting visual scenes such as surfing and parachuting in the movie. Therefore, this movie was destined to not have much success during the awards season. Regardless of the comments of the outside media, after Christmas, Firefly began the merger and reorganization in an orderly manner according to the plan. After detailed planning, Eric would merge Pixar Studio, Digital Domain, and Black Ant Film into Firefly Pictures. Because these assets were all unlisted companies under Eric's absolute control, the merger process was very smooth. After the merger and reorganization, Firefly would follow the model of a major studio. In addition to film and television production, it also included specialized publicity, legal, market research, strategic planning, and other departments. At the same time, it also had subsidiary companies with relatively independent operating capabilities such as Pixar Studio, Black Ant Film, New Line Cinema, Flower Pictures, and Digital Domain. In addition, Firefly also held 10% of the shares of Fox Television Network. After more than 4 months of planning negotiations with the community of Praia Vista, just after the new year, Firefly officially broke ground on the studio base in Praia Vista. Although it was an unlisted company and outsiders could not obtain detailed information about Firefly, Firefly's series of actions did not escape the eyes of many people. The attention of entertainment-oriented media was still focused on Eric's personal wealth. Professional Hollywood magazines such as Variety were much more professional in their analysis of Firefly. In the face of Firefly's integration and expansion, most of the professional media had a pessimistic attitude. After all, Eric had just experienced a failure at the end of the year with Ghost Detective and Thriller. The total box office of the two movies released at the end of the year was likely to only be a little more than $100 million. Compared to the grand occasion last year when Firefly's movies dominated the year-end holiday box office, Firefly's results this year were a little worse. Moreover, the evidence that the media, who maintained a pessimistic attitude, pointed out was not just the year-end box office. While the results of Shock Point did not meet the media's expectations, because they did not know that the Camerons were divorced, Cameron, who was Catherine Bigelow's husband, was producing Terminator 2, which also fell into the media sites. The media quickly discovered that the film, which had been shot for more than 3 months and had just wrapped up before the end of the year, had cost more than $70 million so far. As a special effects film, the post-production of the film would still cost a lot of money. Therefore, the cost of the film was likely to reach an unprecedented height. It might even become the first film in history to cost more than $100 million. If that was all there was to it, there might be some hope of recouping the cost. After all, the quality of Cameron's films was very guaranteed, and according to the public survey, movie fans had high expectations for the sequel to Terminator. However, many people thought that the movie's schedule was a fatal flaw. Last November, the 34-nation joint forces gathered in the Middle East issued an ultimatum to Saddam. Based on the current situation, this war was inevitable, and the time was likely to be at the end of January. Moreover, so far, not many people thought that the war would end in a short period of time. Since the second half of last year, facing the possible impact of the war on the film and television industry, the 7 major film studios had begun to formulate plans to reduce production. In addition to Terminator 2, there were no other big-budget films scheduled for the summer. Even Batman, which made more than $200 million at the box office last year, had postponed the sequel to the 1992 summer in order to avoid the brunt of the war. It was conceivable that if the war was still ongoing when Terminator 2 was released, the box office of this blockbuster would definitely be severely impacted. Once such a big-budget film with an investment of more than $100 million failed at the box office, it would be a very big blow to the ambitious Firefly. Because of this concern, even Cameron himself hinted to Eric in a meeting that it was best to postpone the release of Terminator 2, even if it was delayed until the end of the year. Eric just comforted him verbally, but he did not agree with Cameron's words. No one in the world knew the process of the Gulf War better than Eric. Therefore, it was the best choice to release Terminator 2 during the summer. Even if the war ended early and the 7 major studios released some big-budget films in a hurry, it was impossible to compete with Terminator 2, which had sufficient publicity and quality. Not only Terminator 2, but Eric also decided to release Toy Story, which had already been completed by Pixar, during the summer. He believed that the box office results of this 3D animation would definitely surprise many people. For this reason, Eric not only invited Tom Hanks to dub for Cowboy Woody, according to the original version, but he also spent a lot of money to release a trailer for Toy Story at this year's Super Bowl. Because the special effects production of Terminator 2 had just begun, they could only regretfully miss the Super Bowl. The first 2 weeks of the new year passed unknowingly. On January 15th, the date of the United Nations Army's ultimatum, the Iraqi army did not have the slightest intention of withdrawing from Kuwait. Instead, they once again carried out a large-scale increase of troops on the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Eric hurriedly handed over the work in his hands and flew to New York. After 2 months of deployment, Chris had already used the $2 billion USD funds in his hands to establish a large number of short positions in crude oil futures according to the original plan. Both of them were nervously waiting for the arrival of the war. Although Eric felt that his little butterfly might affect the progress of the war, he obviously overestimated his influence. At 2 o'clock in the morning on January 17th, the United Nations Army launched an attack on the Iraqi army, just like in his previous life. The high-intensity carpet bombing went on for dozens of hours. In the face of the United Nations Army's absolute air superiority, the Iraqi army had no room to fight back. It was a complete one-sided defeat. At the end of January, the United Nations Army wiped out the Iraqi garrison in Kuwait. Iraq lost 100,000 troops, while the United Nations Army only suffered a few hundred casualties. While the new pattern of the war shocked the world, the international price of crude oil began to plummet. Because of the expectation that the Gulf War would be prolonged, many oil trading companies bought a large number of crude oil futures contracts before the war. The war had only been going on for 2 weeks. In the face of the rapid decline of crude oil prices, countless companies' crude oil futures trading departments announced liquidation and closure. It was said that because of this loss, many companies did not open their futures trading departments for the next 20 years. It was obvious how much losses these companies suffered from this large-scale long trade. Chapter 396. Michael Eisner, who was sitting in a high-end coffee shop in Beverly, looked at his watch again. There were still 5 minutes before the appointed time, but his face was already showing an impatient look. He had been in a state of irritation these days. Disney's consecutive movies last summer had caused losses of hundreds of millions of dollars. None of the movies released at the end of the year had achieved outstanding results. Throughout 1990, if it weren't for Disneyland and brand product sales making up for the losses, Disney would likely have had its first loss since he became CEO. But even if they barely managed to break even, shareholders still began to accuse him of monopolizing power in Disney and oppressing Eric Williams, thus ending the good cooperation between Disney and Firefly. Michael Eisner certainly wouldn't admit the regret in his heart to others. If he had known that it would cause such a situation, he definitely wouldn't have stood out. But it was useless to say this now. After he expressed his reconciliation with Eric through Ghost, it only resulted in Firefly not openly hostile to Disney, but the cooperation between the two sides was impossible. Although he had complete control of Disney's board of directors, Michael Eisner knew very well that this absolute dominance was based on the fact that he could earn enough benefits for Disney shareholders. Only Disney could bring a steady stream of profits and dividends to the shareholders, and in the company where the shareholders were very scattered, the situation of shareholders united against him would not appear. Occasionally, 1 or 2 shareholders would jump out to pick a bone, but it wouldn't have any impact on him, even if it was the Disney family. Therefore, he sat here today and arrived earlier than others, which was rare. Unknowingly, 5 minutes had passed. A waiter finally led Robert Shea to the table. Michael Eisner forced himself to reveal a warm smile as he shook hands with Robert Shea. The two of them sat opposite each other. "I'm really sorry, Michael. Something came up and I'm a little late," Robert Shea said to Michael Eisner after ordering a cup of coffee. Michael Eisner still had a smile on his face as he said, "It's okay, Robert. Besides, you're not late." The two of them chatted for a while before the waiter quickly served the coffee. Robert Shea slowly added a few pieces of sugar for himself with a leisurely look. He didn't seem to have any intention of discussing serious matters. His attitude was obvious. He had been living a good life these days. After getting over the resentment of being kicked out by Firefly, Robert Shea found that he was even more glorious than when he was the CEO of Firefly because he had the script of Throat Cut Island that he had snatched from Eric. The 7 major film companies had lowered their stance and expressed goodwill to him, hoping to cooperate with him to develop the Throat Cut Island project. Of course, Robert Shea had thought of producing Throat Cutter Island independently, but it wasn't easy to distribute a movie with such a large investment. Without the new line, it was impossible for him to support the release of a blockbuster movie like Cutthroat Island with the connections he had now. Unless he was willing to patiently accumulate for a few years, it was inevitable to rely on the distribution channels of the 7 major film companies. But out of the resentment of being kicked out of Firefly, Robert Shea was eager to make a comeback. Of course, he also had the intention of using Throat Cut Island to annoy Eric, so he had decided to cooperate with the 7 major film companies. These days, he had been shuttling back and forth between the 7 executives, hoping to use the chip in his hand to fight for the greatest benefits for himself. Michael Eisner looked at Robert Shea, who was in a difficult position, and sneered. He said without leaving a trace, "I heard that the kid went to New York again." Of course, Robert Shea knew who Michael Eisner was referring to. His expression became gloomy. It must be because of the oil price fluctuation again. Maybe he made some money last time and wants to make a fortune this time. Young people always don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Not only did he refuse the invitation of the HFPA, Hollywood Foreign Press Association, but he didn't even attend this year's Golden Globe Award ceremony. This time, he must have offended the HFPA. In the future, it won't be so easy for Firefly's films to win awards. Michael Eisner didn't particularly care about the Golden Globe Awards and the Oscars. MGM had more than 150 Oscars, which ranked first among all film companies, but it was still half dead. Only those small companies in the second-third tier would care very much about the profits brought by the Golden Globe Awards and the Oscars. From this, it could be seen that Robert Shea's vision was still limited. Michael Eisner suddenly felt that Eric kicking Robert Shea out of Firefly was the right choice. That kid will reap what he sowed sooner or later, Robert. Now, let's talk about Throat Island, Michael Eisner said bluntly. Robert Shea put down the coffee in his hand and said energetically, "Let's talk about Disney's conditions first. Michael, I'm still very inclined to cooperate with Disney, but you also need to come up with conditions that can move me." Michael Eisner said, "It's a 40-60 split, including all the investment and distribution. You get 40%, and Disney gets 60%. Of course, you can also get this proportion of the profits." Robert Shea felt incredulous. Looking at Michael Eisner's serious expression, he sneered and said, "Are you kidding, Michael? Even if it's 50-50, I won't agree to it, let alone 40-60. I'm really sorry, I think I should leave. Everyone's time is very precious." "Why are you in such a hurry, Robert? Why don't you let me finish?" Michael Eisner waved at Robert Shea with a faint smile. Noticing Michael Eisner's abnormal expression, Robert Shea hesitated for a moment before sitting back down. Michael Eisner continued, "Let's talk about Ghost first. Back then, Eric Williams said that other than him, the possibility of success in the hands of others was not high. I didn't believe it at first, but after Ghost was released, I realized that he was right. If it wasn't for the tear-jerking, 'Oh, my love,' the grade of this movie would have dropped by more than one level, and the box office would have definitely shrunk greatly. And other than him, if it were any other director or composer, the chances of connecting this classic old song from decades ago with Ghost are infinitely close to zero." "Does this have anything to do with what we're talking about today?" Robert Shea asked impatiently. Michael Eisner nodded and looked at Robert Shea with bright eyes. He said confidently, "Of course. Do you know why I'm not as anxious as other film companies, and why I've only contacted you now?" Robert Shea instinctively had a strong sense of foreboding. He stuttered and asked, "Why?" Chapter 397. Michael Eisner said, "During this time, Disney has been negotiating with Rainier Harlan and Gina Davis. Now Disney has signed a 3-year contract with them. Within 3 years, Rainier Harlan and Gina Davis will not work for any film company other than Disney. Robert Shea was stunned for a moment before he realized who the two people Michael Eisner was talking about were. At the same time, he also understood that he had made a big mistake because of his negligence. He should have signed the contract with these two people first before negotiating with the Big Seven. When Eric contacted Bruce Evans, the owner of the script of Cutthroat Island, he had revealed his intention to invite the two of them to be the director and the female lead. After he bought the script of Cutthroat Island at a high price, Bruce Evans, who had already understood the ins and outs of the matter, had specially explained it to him. Faced with Michael Eisner's unabashed aggressiveness, Robert Shea braced himself and said, "Hollywood is not short of directors and actresses. I can replace them. Don't even think about blackmailing me. Don't even think about it." "I'm not blackmailing you. We're talking about cooperation now." Michael Eisner's tone became very cold. There was no trace of the pleasantness when he cooperated with Robert Shea on the overseas distribution rights of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Cutthroat Island is different from Ghost, which cost less than $30 million. This is a mega production that costs at least $70 million. The total cost after publicity is likely to exceed $100 million. Just like the anecdote about Ghost of the Humans that I just said, if the box office of Cutthroat Island lost because of the replacement of the director, such a big investment movie was likely to lose money, and the impact of the box office loss was continuous. The income from the subsequent video distribution and TV broadcast rights of the movie would be greatly reduced. So you see, you have the script, but Disney has the director and heroine. We still need to distribute the movie. In this way, you still have the advantage. Of course, you can also wait for 3 years, but if I remember correctly, the contract you signed with Bruce Evans only lasts for 3 years. If you don't produce a film in 3 years, the ownership of the script will automatically return to Bruce Evans. Do you think you can get this script again next time? Robert Shea's hand, which was placed on the armrest, was trembling rapidly. Clearly, he was very agitated. Facing Michael Eisner's aggressive gaze, Robert Shea finally exhaled dejectedly. "All right, let's talk again." New York had just had a heavy snowfall, and the weather had become unusually cold. In the same suite as last time, Eric woke up in the morning and jogged on the treadmill for half an hour. He took a shower and planned to go downstairs for breakfast as usual. Walking into the elevator, Eric pressed the button and looked at the indicator in boredom, allowing the elevator to slide down. When it reached the 3rd floor, the elevator suddenly stopped. Knowing that someone was coming in, Eric took a step back to the corner. The elevator door opened, and a tall woman with her hands in the pockets of her black windbreaker stepped in. Their eyes met, and the two of them said in unison, "It's you?" Eric gestured for the woman to come in, closed the elevator door, and asked, "Catherine, why are you in New York?" Catherine Bigelow curiously sized up Eric and said, "I'm here in New York to relax. What about you?" "I'm here to make money," Eric said concisely. Catherine Bigelow thought that Eric was joking, so she teased him with a smile. How vulgar. With just 2 sentences, the elevator reached the ground floor. Eric and Catherine Bigelow walked out of the elevator side by side and said, "You don't mind having breakfast with a vulgar person like me, right?" "My treat." "Sure, I won't stand on ceremony with a tycoon like you." They walked into the restaurant and found a table to sit down. Just as they ordered breakfast from the waiter, a tall white man walked over and nodded slightly at Catherine Bigelow. He handed a stack of newspapers and a folder to Eric and said, "Mr. Williams, this is today's newspaper and a few documents that were faxed over from Los Angeles last night. Mr. Hansen instructed you to call him back after reading them." "I got it." Eric nodded. Because of Catherine's presence, he didn't plan on reading these things before breakfast was served. He just put the newspapers and documents aside. Catherine Bigelow watched the man who suddenly appeared return to his seat in the corner and asked curiously, "Who is that?" "Where's Aaron?" "My bodyguard, Aaron, is in Los Angeles, so I got him to be my temporary assistant." "Let's talk about you. Why did you suddenly appear here?" Catherine Bigelow said, "I lived in Soho Borough for 10 years. I recently divorced that bastard, so I came to visit some old friends and relax. Eric remembered that Catherine Bigelow and Cameron still worked together, but now, the woman was obviously still holding a grudge against Cameron for betraying her. She wouldn't forgive him in a short period of time. Jim has really gone too far this time. Do you want me to help you deal with him? For example, lower the budget of Terminator 2 to 18 million? Catherine took the breakfast from the waiter and rolled her eyes at Eric. Forget it. Don't think I don't know that you're a little bastard too. Eric, who had just taken a sip of milk, almost choked. Your own yard is on fire. Why are you stirring up the fire sprouts on me? What do you think? If you ask me, your thinking is too extreme. It's not good. It's easy to become a cynical bigot. Catherine snorted softly and didn't continue listening to Eric's nonsense. After eating breakfast for a while, she asked, "Isn't Firefly reorganizing? Why did you leave that mess and come to New York?" "It's really to make money." Eric pointed in the direction of the New York Chamber of Commerce. "Taking advantage of the war in the Middle East to make some profit on the price difference of crude oil futures." "Oh, so you're a little profiteer who makes money from the war." "I'll admit that I'm a profiteer. Can you remove the word little?" "No." Seeing Eric's depressed look, Catherine laughed. "Hey, how much did you make? Is it as much as you make a movie?" Eric shrugged. He didn't dare to tell the truth for fear of scaring the woman. He only said, "The Federation made most of it." No one expected that this war would be fought so cleanly. Before the war, the Federation and Saudi Arabia worked together and sold a large number of futures contracts at a high price through crude oil reserves. Now that oil prices have been cut in half, they've made at least hundreds of billions. We small fries can only follow behind and drink some soup. Catherine still knew a little about futures. She sighed and said, 100 billion. Doesn't that mean that there are people who have to lose that much? Well, if you pay attention to the newspapers, you'll find that a large number of oil trading companies around the world have cancelled their securities departments. This loss will last them for more than a decade. Chapter 398. Women always ate less for breakfast. Catherine Bigelow quickly finished her simple sandwich, sipped her juice, and chatted patiently with Eric, who was still eating the ham sandwich in front of him. After Eric finished eating, Catherine asked, "What are you going to do next?" Eric pointed to the newspapers and documents next to him. "The New York Chamber of Commerce opens at 10 o'clock. It's about time for me to finish reading these." "Then take your time." "I'll leave first." Catherine nodded politely to Eric and stood up to leave. Eric did not ask her to stay. For a woman with a strong personality like Catherine, the more eager he appeared, the easier it would be to arouse her disgust. Playing hard to get was the best choice. Watching the woman leave, he asked the waiter to take away their tableware before opening the stack of newspapers next to him. He first chose the Los Angeles Times to read. He briefly glanced at the International Current Affairs section. The United Nations Army had begun to clean up. There was nothing else special. Eric quickly turned to the entertainment section. Disney announces co-production of Throat Cut Island with Robert Shea, set for June 28. Today is really a good day. The corner of Eric's mouth curled into a faint sneer as he thought to himself. He had been worried that something would happen to his plan, but things were still developing according to his plan. Disney and Robert Shea had fallen into this pit together, so it was time for Chris to speed up the acquisition of Disney's stock. Although Throat Cut Island was not a film with special effects, it was a big-budget film with an investment of more than $70 million. The 5-month production cycle was neither short nor long. Judging from the article, Disney and Robert Shea also followed his secret arrangement and invited Rennie Harlin and Geena Davis to be the director and heroine. Then, this movie was likely to maintain the standard of the original. Disney and Robert Shea set Throat Cut Island on June 28, and Toy Story 2 and Terminator 2 on June 21 and July 5, respectively. Their intention was very obvious, but it was unknown who would be the one to snipe who at that time. Catherine Bigelow returned to her room, simply tidied up her makeup, put on a pair of camel-colored leather boots, picked up her bag and went downstairs again. She was going to a friend's party in the morning. As she passed through the hotel lobby, the woman could not help but slow down and look in the direction of the restaurant. Eric was still sitting in his original seat with his legs crossed and his lips slightly pursed. He looked down and read the newspaper in his hand seriously, and exuded a calmness that was completely inconsistent with his age. If they weren't familiar with him, it would be hard for them to realize that he was only 20 years old at first glance. Catherine looked at the dining room as she walked. When her line of sight was about to be blocked by the wall, the woman stopped in her tracks, but she quickly retracted her gaze and walked out. Walking out of the hotel door, the cold air outside instantly enveloped the woman. Catherine could not help but put her hands in the pockets of her windbreaker. After waiting by the road for a while, she flagged down a taxi and got in. Inside the air-conditioned car, the warm temperature gathered the woman's thoughts again. Thinking of the scene she had just seen, the woman suddenly remembered that Eric did not mention Saving Private Ryan again. During the filming of Point Shock, he was quite eager to let her take over the project. The two had a lot of discussions about the script, but on the one hand, it was because Point Shock was not completed yet. On the other hand, she was indeed hesitant about the project, so she had been delaying it. This little fellow couldn't have forgotten, right? However, she immediately denied this conjecture. How could such a smart little guy forget about it? But why didn't he mention it? Or was it just a whim at that time, and then he realized that it was impossible for a woman to control such a large-scale project, so he decided to ignore it and give the movie to a more suitable male director after a while? Catherine leaned against the window and looked at the occasional remaining snow on the roadside. She quickly felt that this situation might have something to do with Point Shock. Point Shock was now off the air, and the box office had stopped at more than 61 million. Catherine was very satisfied with the movie's box office. At least this result had allowed Firefly to recoup its costs. The profit from the subsequent video release was pure profit. For a female director, if the movie she made did not bring in profits for the studio, it would be a much more serious blow to her career than a male director. Therefore, in the face of this $30 million budget movie, Catherine was under no less pressure than any director of a mega-budget movie. However, the box office of this movie was far from the box office of Eric's previous movies. It must be because of this that he did not mention Saving Private Ryan anymore. That must be it. What a profit-minded little profiteer. The taxi stopped. Catherine paid the driver and got out of the taxi. As the cold air hit her body again, the woman's mind calmed down and she quickly put these messy thoughts aside. Anyway, the box office of Point Shock was good. As long as she found a project that she was interested in, she would definitely be able to get investment. Missing out on a movie was nothing. Cheering himself on, he reflected on himself for a moment, thinking about the gains and losses that he shouldn't have. He straightened the collar of his windbreaker, hung the satchel on his arm, and put his hands into his pockets again. His hard-soled leather boots tapped on the road as he walked towards a street on the left. A gust of cold wind blew. She shrunk her neck and couldn't help but think that maybe she should buy a scarf. For the next few days, because the two had a strong sense of time, they would meet at the restaurant every morning. I suddenly feel that your life is really too different from your age. It's unbelievable. That morning, the two of them sat in their usual seats, and Catherine couldn't help but say. Eric looked up at the woman and said, "Then what kind of life do you think I should live?" Catherine made a meaningless gesture and said, "Anyway, it shouldn't be like this. It goes against my common sense." Eric smiled and said, "Maybe I'm trying to get your attention. You know, I'm quite good at coaxing women." Catherine glared at Eric, but her cheeks couldn't help but blush. She asked hesitantly, "Don't tell me you really have that kind of complex like what the newspapers say? I'm a lot older than you." "What kind of newspapers are you reading?" "The proper newspapers usually praise me for being young and promising. They don't talk about this kind of nonsense." "I forgot the name. I occasionally saw a feature about you." Eric thought for a bit and explained, "Let's put it this way. I prefer to spend time with women who are close to my mental age. That way, we can have more topics to talk about. You see, we've been chatting very happily these days, right? Chapter 399. Taken aback, Kathleen reluctantly admitted, "That does seem to be the case." Because the topic was a bit awkward, Kathleen planned to leave early after eating her breakfast. Eric stopped her this time. He picked up the inconspicuous bag by his feet and handed it to Kathleen. "This is for you. You've been hanging out with your neck bare these days. I feel cold just looking at you." Kathleen opened the bag and pulled out a white cashmere scarf. The woman hesitated before pushing the bag back. "Thank you, but I don't really like white. It's better." "Then leave it here. I'll get someone to throw it away later." "You." Kathleen glared at Eric and picked up the bag. "Okay, I'll take it." After returning to her room, the woman walked to the bathroom and put on the scarf in front of the mirror. It had to be said that black was the most versatile color. The woman in the mirror was wearing a black trench coat and a white scarf, which made her look more feminine. But this was something she had been deliberately avoiding. As a female director, if she wanted to survive in Hollywood, she had to minimize gender differences as much as possible. She had been working hard to do so. However, she wasn't working right now, so she might as well wear it. She quickly found an excuse for herself. It was very reasonable. When she walked through the hotel lobby, she stopped for some reason and went to the restaurant again. Eric, who was reading the newspaper, looked up at her and praised, "You're very beautiful." "Thank you." She sat down across from him. Eric asked, "What's up?" "There's a charity art exhibition at the Columbia Library this morning. Are you interested in taking a look?" Facing Eric's gaze, the woman quickly said, "You're a big investor. This art exhibition is to raise money for a foundation for orphaned and disabled children. Maybe you can donate more money." "Oh, I see. Let me make a few calls and cancel today's event." Kathleen immediately said, "If you're too busy, then forget it." Eric ignored him. He took the mobile phone and made a few calls in front of Kathleen. He then looked up at the woman. "So, when are we leaving?" "Now, the exhibition starts at 9 o'clock. After saying this, Catherine saw Eric stand up without hesitation. She felt a little uneasy, but it was not the kind of uneasiness when danger was approaching. Instead, it was an inexplicable sense of uneasiness, as if a crack had appeared in some sort of defense at the bottom of his heart. The two of them walked out of the hotel side by side. Catherine was about to flag down a taxi when a black Chrysler stopped in front of them. Eric considerately opened the car door for her. Catherine hesitated for a moment before getting in. "Columbia University, right?" Eric sat down next to her and asked. Catherine nodded. She sat there with her back straight out of habit and her hands on her knees. Eric told the driver to drive. He didn't know how they became friends. "Can you call me Becky, Oh, can I have an autograph?" "Of course." Eric nodded. While Becky Murphy went to find a pen and paper, he once again threw a look at Catherine for help. After Eric signed the booklet that Becky Murphy handed over, Catherine said, "Okay, Becky, don't you have other things to do? We're here to see the art exhibition." "Of course," Becky Murphy said. "You guys can do whatever you want. Professor Clark will come over later. I have to go to the door to greet him." After that, Becky Murphy turned and walked away after saying goodbye to Eric. Because it was a little early, there were not many people on the first floor of the library that was temporarily set up as an exhibition hall. Eric and Catherine walked around the hall with many oil paintings. Chapter 400. After Back to 17, Eric had received many invitations, but he no longer appeared in any movie, not even as a cameo. Even so, because his rise was too legendary, his personal photos would appear in newspapers and magazines every 2 to 3 days. Therefore, when he walked on the street, even if he was not recognized at a glance, there would always be people who felt that he had seen him before. As more and more people gathered in the library hall, more and more guests attending the art exhibition looked at Eric. However, most of them seemed to think that it might just be a resemblance, so they did not come up to talk to him. In order to avoid unnecessary harassment, Eric had to take out his sunglasses and put them on. His appearance was a little different in the hall, and he was slightly teased by Catherine. This painting is about the story of the golden apple. When the human hero Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis held a wedding, all the gods were invited, but the goddess of discord, Eris, was rejected. Holding a grudge, Eris broke into the wedding scene, took out a golden apple, and said that she wanted to give it to the most beautiful woman present, which caused a dispute. Zeus's wife Hera, the goddess of wisdom Athena, and the goddess of love Aphrodite all thought that they should be the one to get the golden apple. In the midst of the dispute, Zeus appointed the Trojan prince Paris, who was shepherding on Mount Ida, to adjudicate the dispute. The man in the picture was Paris, and the three goddesses were on his right. Because of the goddess of love's promise to let Paris fall in love with the most beautiful woman in the world, Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. Then, with the help of the goddess of love, Paris abducted the Spartan queen Helen, who was considered the most beautiful woman in the world. This incident was the trigger for the Trojan War. The two walked to an oil painting in the northwest corner, and Catherine explained to Eric in a low voice. Although she majored in art criticism at Columbia University, she did not explain the composition and color of the works in the exhibition hall to Eric. She only talked about the various background stories involved in these oil paintings. Although Eric knew a lot of them, he did not intend to interrupt the woman. Instead, he listened with great interest. After Catherine finished speaking, she looked at Eric, who seemed to be deep in thought, and asked curiously in a low voice, "What are you thinking about? Do you feel a little bored?" "Of course not." Eric shook his head. "I'm thinking of getting them to do a project about European mythology and history after I return to Los Angeles. The theme of this genre is a huge gold mine. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of special effects and manpower, there haven't been many outstanding works in this genre over the years." Catherine was the kind of person who believed in integrating work into her instincts. Therefore, she did not tease Eric for still thinking about work under such circumstances. Instead, she asked, "You mean epic movies, like Ben-Hur and Spartacus?" Both Ben-Hur and Spartacus were European epic movies produced in Hollywood in the early 60s. The former told the story of Ben-Hur, a Jew who resisted the invasion of the Roman Empire. At that time, it won 11 Academy Awards, becoming an unsurpassable record in the history of the Oscars. In the original space-time, although Titanic surpassed Ben-Hur in terms of nominations, it only won the same number of awards as Ben-Hur. The latter was the masterpiece of the movie master, Stan Kubrick. Both movies were extremely expensive at that time, and they used tens of thousands of extras. Today, the Hollywood industry had developed to an extremely standardized level. Such a scale of manpower was difficult to replicate. Therefore, if they wanted to make this type of movie again, they would have to wait for the development of special effects. Eric and Catherine left the painting of the golden apple together. As they walked, he said, "Just like Ben-Hur and Spartacus, these two classics were based on literary works at that time, not historical facts. I think this is the key to their great success in the box office and awards." Catherine asked, "Why can't they be adapted according to historical facts?" "I think it's more realistic to follow history." The two stopped in front of another oil painting. Eric explained, "But the real history is always too cruel and unlikable. If we were to develop this type of movie, the investment would definitely be at the level of a super big production. If we want to recoup the cost, we would have to make a large-scale adaptation of history to cater to the tastes of modern audiences. It's still the same saying, the audience always sees what they want to see." After Eric finished speaking, he looked at the woman beside him. Although Catherine's works were not many, she always relished in conveying certain social knowledge to the audience. Moreover, she often preached. This style not only did not receive recognition from awards, but also caused the audience to dislike her if she did not pay attention. In the original space-time, it was not until The Bomb Locker, which won Catherine an Oscar more than 10 years later, that the woman changed this shortcoming. The Bomb Locker took the attitude of a calm bystander and described the daily life of a bomb disposal team on the battlefield of Iraq. It did not preach or comment, but after everyone watched this movie, they would naturally feel disgusted and resistant to war. This was the best way to promote anti-war propaganda. Catherine looked at the oil painting in front of her. This time, she did not explain to Eric in a low voice. Instead, she said, "I feel like you're talking about my movie?" Eric smiled. "That's right. You see, I didn't say anything about your movie, but you can understand my purpose. This is the best way to convey an idea." Catherine remembered what Eric said a few months ago on the set of Shock Point, and fell into a short period of contemplation. Eric did not disturb her. He stood aside and waited silently. When it was close to 12 o'clock, Eric chose the golden apple that caused the conversation between the two. He signed a check for $50,000 and handed it to the organizer. As for how much of this money could be used to help the so-called orphans and disabled children, it was not something Eric considered. At noon, Catherine's good friend, Becky Murphy, took the two of them to have a simple lunch together. The two of them did not go back. In the afternoon, under Becky Murphy's suggestion, they listened to a 4-hour lecture on European history in an auditorium in Columbia. During the lecture, Becky Murphy was very curious about Eric's performance. As Catherine's best friend, Becky Murphy had already heard about the divorce between Catherine and Cameron, so she was very curious about the relationship between Catherine and Eric. During the lecture, Becky Murphy often whispered to Catherine and glanced at Eric strangely from time to time. Chapter 401. Eric soon learned about Becky Murphy's identity. This woman, who was about the same age as Catherine, was now a lecturer at Columbia University. Back then, the two of them were classmates in the same dormitory. Although their personalities were somewhat different, they unexpectedly became good friends. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening when they walked out of the auditorium where the lecture was held. Eric and Catherine were about to leave, but Becky Murphy forced them to go to her house as guests. Unable to refuse, the two of them had no choice but to comply. Becky Murphy's house was in a small apartment on the Upper West Side. Her husband, Charlton Hawkins, was also a lecturer at Columbia University. The two had been married for 6 years, but they had no children. "Eric, you have been with Catherine for a long time. You have to be careful. Although she is usually a very gentle woman, she is full of violence in her bones." At dinner, after drinking a few glasses of red wine, Becky Murphy began to talk more. "I haven't noticed this yet. How did you know?" Eric asked curiously. Catherine, who was sitting next to Eric, had a helpless expression on her face. Becky Murphy put down the goblet and looked at Kathleen, as if she was asking for her opinion. But soon, she said to herself, "Let's not talk about her movies. When we were all students at Columbia, many people found out about this. There was a painting class." Becky Murphy said, stretching out her arms and gesturing. She said in a slightly exaggerated tone, "Such a big piece of paper," and she drew a bloody thigh on it. "It was so scary." "Becky, that was obviously not a thigh." "I remember explaining that it was an arm," Catherine retorted helplessly. "Ah, I always thought it was a thigh." Becky Murphy's eyes widened, and then she said, "But what's the difference? Anyway, it's still bloody. Pete and I have always been worried that you might have a split personality and suddenly become a she-devil when we are not prepared. You might pull out a knife and kill us all." "I want to sew your little mouth shut right now," Catherine said, glaring at Becky. Everyone at the table laughed. Throughout dinner, Becky Murphy kept talking about Catherine's past, and Eric's understanding of women became more specific. It was not until 9 o'clock in the evening that Eric and Catherine walked out of Becky Murphy's house. Eric's car was already parked in front of Becky's house. The two got into the car, and after saying goodbye to Becky Murphy and her husband, the car quickly drove to Broadway. After 10 odd minutes, Eric noticed that the woman sitting beside him would rub her forehead from time to time and asked with concern, "Did you drink too much and feel a little dizzy?" Catherine nodded. "It's okay. I'll just go back and rest for a while." Eric asked the driver to stop the car and open the door. Although Kathleen felt a little strange, she still got out of the car. Stepping on the streets of Manhattan at night, the cold air soon made Kathleen feel a little more comfortable. "Let's walk for a while. You'll feel better that way," Eric said and took the lead to walk to the curb. The bodyguard drove the car and followed behind the two of them unhurriedly. Eric and Catherine walked side by side on the street, looking at the shops on both sides of the street and the traffic on the road. They did not say much. When they passed by an alley, Eric saw a group of young people gathered at the door of a dance hall. He had an idea and pulled the woman next to him. "Let's go over there and have a look." Catherine took a look and was about to shake her head and say forget it, but she saw that Eric had already turned into the alley. The woman hesitated for a moment, but still followed. This was a discotheque. Perhaps because the discotheque was too full, the guards at the door did not let all the young people outside in. Eric and the woman squeezed through the crowd and came to the entrance. A chain was placed in front of the crowd. Eric was about to communicate with the guard to let them in. A man in a suit standing behind the guard with his hands behind his back looked at the two of them and raised his chin at the guard. The guard took off the chain and signaled that the two of them could go in. After checking their coats, the two of them walked deep into the long corridor. Eric looked at the woman next to him and asked curiously, "Is this your first time here?" Catherine nodded. "I've never been to a place like this before." Eric said with a smile, "Actually, me too." Before they walked into the hall, Eric and Catherine heard dynamic music. When they came to the hall, under the flashing lights, the two of them saw countless men and women dancing to the music on the dance floor. Although the temperature outside was below zero, most of the women in the hall were wearing revealing clothes. The eyes were full of sexy slender waists and thighs. Many men were also bare-chested, revealing large patches of tattoos. When Catherine saw this scene, she was obviously not used to it. "Why don't we go back? It's already past 9. "Since we're here, let's sit for a while," Eric said as he reached out and pulled the woman toward the bar. Catherine felt that her hand was suddenly grabbed by Eric. She quickly broke free and glared at Eric. "Don't do this." "Okay." Eric smiled. Although the woman said so, he did not see much disgust in her eyes. After ordering 2 glasses of whiskey, Eric took the woman to an empty sofa in the corner and sat there. "I'm really crazy to come to a place like this with you." Catherine sat down next to Eric. She did not relax on the back of the sofa like Eric. Instead, she habitually straightened her back and curiously looked at the crazy dancing crowd on the dance floor. "It makes sense that I haven't been here before. It's hard to imagine that you haven't been here either. Didn't you live here for many years? Some people will never do something in their life, even if those things are close to them." "Oh, I see." Eric glanced at the woman's face, which looked less than 30 years old, and nodded. If Catherine hadn't been able to maintain a restrained attitude towards life, she would definitely be a different person now. A place like a nightclub was undoubtedly the most erosive place. Sipping the whiskey in his hand, Eric suddenly asked, "I remember that more than 10 years ago, there seemed to be a get-out-of-disco movement. Do you know about it?" Catherine nodded. "That time, Becky and the others just happened to drag me to watch the game. Unexpectedly, in the middle of the game, someone lit a lot of disco records. Later, for some reason, the young people on the street all changed into t-shirts with 'Disco Sucks' printed on them. During that time, many disco clubs closed." Chapter 402. Speaking of the get-out-of-disco movement, the 1978 film Grease, starring John Travolta, could not be avoided. This disco-themed musical film not only won the box office that year, but also released the original soundtrack record for the first time. Not only did that record set a sales record that could not be surpassed for many years, but it also led the disco record industry to the peak. However, this peak did not last long. A year after the release of Grease, due to an accidental opportunity, the get-out-of-disco movement broke out to boycott disco. In Eric's view, there was obviously a struggle for interests in this movement, just like the suppression of Michael Jackson later. Because of the popularity of disco, which had a very low production cost, it had a great impact on the traditional recording industry. It caused the traditional recording industry to use that accident to manipulate public opinion and set off a movement to suppress disco. Eric was talking with Catherine about the past when he caught a glimpse of 2 girls approaching from the corner of his eye. When the 2 girls came to his side, Eric was sure that their target was him. He looked up and saw that one of the girls had a ponytail. Her expression was a little shy, and her head was slightly lowered. The other girl had shoulder-length hair, very white skin, and wore a black sequin dress that shone under the light. The short-haired girl saw Eric looking at them, so she mustered up her courage and asked, "Excuse me, are you Eric Williams?" Eric did not answer. Instead, he looked at the woman sitting next to him with a surprised look. "Look, Catherine, someone thinks I'm Eric Williams again, but I think I should be more handsome than him, right?" Catherine rolled her eyes at Eric and did not answer. The two girls believed Eric's performance. They looked at each other for a moment, not knowing whether to leave or not. Eric stood up and reached out to the girl with the very white skin. "Hello, my name is Ellen Fissman." The girl in the sequin dress reached out to Eric. "Hello, Ellen, you can call me Charlotte. This is Alice." Eric shook hands with the ponytailed girl next to Charlotte and said with a smile, "Can I buy you a drink?" The two women glanced at Catherine, who was sitting next to Eric. Seeing that the woman didn't say anything, Charlotte nodded. "Okay." So, under Catherine Bigelow's speechless gaze, Eric took the two girls to the bar. After ordering a few glasses of wine, Eric stayed at the bar and chatted with the two girls. In less than 5 minutes, the two girls were smiling from ear to ear from Eric's coaxing. The short-haired girl named Charlotte even waved her little fists and lightly punched Eric's body, as if she couldn't wait to stick to Eric's body. Then, Catherine was even more speechless when she saw Eric holding the hands of the two girls at the same time and walking to the dance floor. Amidst the explosive music, Eric skillfully danced. The two girls also treated Eric as the center and surrounded him like two butterflies. Seeing Eric put his hands on the ponytailed girl's exposed waist, Catherine, who already felt unnatural, could not help but whisper, "Little pervert, you actually said that it's your first time here." Just as Catherine was considering whether she should leave early, a white man in his 30s came to her side. "Miss, can I sit here?" Looking at the person who suddenly appeared in front of her, Catherine's first reaction was to look at Eric. However, to her disappointment, Eric did not seem to be paying attention to her. He was still dancing with the two girls, but his perverted hands were already wrapped around the waist of the other short-haired girl and were faintly sliding down. "Sorry, sir, there's already someone here." Catherine stared at Eric's hands for 2 seconds before saying coldly to the man in front of her, "Are you talking about that boy?" The man pointed in the direction of Eric and smiled. "I don't think he'll be back any time soon. To be honest, it's very inappropriate to leave a lady here to dance with other girls." As the man spoke, he sat down beside Catherine. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Bernie Wesley. I work on Wall Street." The other party had always been polite, so Catherine couldn't treat her coldly. She simply introduced herself, "Catherine. Catherine, actually, I've noticed you long ago. You have a quiet and restrained temperament. I don't think you should be here at all. Let me guess, you're a doctor, lawyer, accountant?" Bernie Wesley guessed a few times in a row, but he did not get it right. Seeing that the other party was going to continue guessing, Catherine could only say, "I'm a director." Bernie Wesley did not feel embarrassed at all. Although he did not pay much attention to Hollywood, he knew some of the unspoken rules in Hollywood. "It's unbelievable. You're so beautiful. If you say you're an actress, it'll be easier for people to accept. Directing is not a job that women can play." Although the other party's tone did not have any meaning of discrimination, Catherine was still a little disgusted when she heard these words. She frowned slightly. Bernie Wesley was obviously good at reading people's expressions. He immediately changed his words. "Of course, there are still many outstanding female directors in Hollywood. By the way, what works have you produced? Maybe I should take a look?" "You won't be interested," Catherine said. Bernie Wesley thought that Catherine did not have any outstanding works. Looking at the age of the woman in front of him, he felt that the woman was at most 30 years old. Male directors of this age might not necessarily be able to produce any works, let alone a woman. Bernie Wesley thought for a moment and quickly said, "Then do you have any projects that you're interested in?" "You know, our company actually has investments in Hollywood. If you have a good script in your hands, Maybe I can help you pull some strings? Contrary to Bernie Wesley's expectations, the woman did not show any signs of being moved. She said lightly, "Sorry, I don't think there's a need." "Don't be so absolute. Why don't you leave a contact number? You'll find out when it can be of great help to you." Although Catherine was a very patient person, she was also disgusted by the man in front of her. She said straightforwardly, "Mr. Wesley, if it's possible, I want to be alone for a while." "Oh, don't be like this, Catherine. This is a nightclub." Bernie Wesley did not seem to feel the woman's disgust. He said with a smile, "Why don't we go dance together? If you don't know how, I can." Before he finished speaking, Bernie Wesley felt a hand patting his shoulder. He looked up and saw two tall men in suits had appeared behind him without him knowing. "Sir, please don't pester this lady, okay?" Bernie Wesley thought that the two tall men were thugs in the nightclub in the name of security guards. They were meddling in other people's business. He wanted to use his friendship with the nightclub owner to reprimand them. But he soon noticed the difference. The two people in front of him did not have the slightest ruffian aura of the nightclub thugs. Although their appearance was not eye-catching at first glance, the cold aura exuding from them was definitely not something that a hooligan could have. He happened to see this aura from the bodyguards of the big boss behind the company at an annual meeting. He heard that these people were often professional soldiers who retired from the special forces. Most of them had killed people before. A person who could have such a high level of bodyguard was definitely not someone a small investment manager like him could afford to offend. Bernie Wesley sensibly stood up, made an apologetic gesture to Catherine, and walked away somewhat awkwardly. Catherine thanked Eric's two bodyguards softly. The two nodded slightly in response and quietly retreated to an inconspicuous corner. Looking at the crowd on the dance floor again, she happened to notice that Eric was also looking in her direction. He even made a gesture to her that it was done. It was obvious that the two bodyguards who had helped her out were under his orders. Realizing that he had been paying attention to her, for some reason, she felt a little gratified that she couldn't detect. Catherine, a lone woman, had been sitting on the sofa for a long time. Bernie Wesley wasn't the only one who wanted to strike up a conversation with her. The people who had originally planned to wait for Bernie Wesley to return in defeat noticed what had just happened and no longer dared to step forward. The woman who had a vacuum beside her became exceptionally conspicuous, and many people looked over curiously. In the following days, she, a woman who occupied a row of sofas by herself but no one dared to come forward to strike up a conversation with her, became the topic of conversation among the guests of this ballroom. Eric went crazy with the two girls for a while before leaving the dance floor, intending to bring Catherine back to the hotel. Seeing that Eric was about to leave, the short-haired girl pulled her companion out. After leaving the ballroom and walking into the alley, the short-haired girl who had just worn a sequin dress had already put on a dark trench coat. She looked up at Catherine, who was walking silently on the other side of Eric. The short-haired girl mustered up her courage and said to Eric, "Ellen, why don't you come to my place?" "Huh?" Eric thought he had heard wrongly. But the short-haired girl continued, "I mean, why don't you come to my place? Also, Alice and I live together." The hint of fragrance was already quite obvious. The ponytailed girl behind her, Alice, pinched her shyly and looked up at Eric with some anticipation in her eyes. "Forget it. It's too late now." Eric smiled, thinking to himself, could it be that I've gone overboard with my teasing? It shouldn't be. Although he rejected the invitation of the two girls and walked out of the alley, Eric still thoughtfully called a taxi for the two girls. He watched the other party leave before getting into the car driven by the bodyguard with Catherine. In the taxi that didn't drive far, the short-haired girl named Charlotte turned her head to look at Eric, who had gotten into a black car at the alley entrance, and sighed softly. Alice also turned her head to take a look before asking, "What's wrong, Charlotte? Didn't you notice? He's actually Eric Williams." Chapter 403. When Alice heard Charlotte's words, she immediately turned around and looked back. Eric's black car had already disappeared into the late-night traffic. Alice turned around in disappointment and said to Charlotte, "Why didn't you tell me just now? Then, I could have asked him for an autograph." He doesn't want to admit it. What's the use of telling him? Charlotte shrugged and said with a little regret, "Sigh, it's a pity. If we could, we definitely wouldn't have to squeeze into that small apartment by the street anymore. Maybe we could even go to Hollywood." Alice blushed. "No wonder you said that just now." Charlotte smiled and pinched Alice's body. "Aren't you looking forward to it very much too?" "Actually, I judged that he was Eric from the woman beside him." "Did you hear him just now? He called that woman Catherine. I was sure that she was Catherine Bigelow. She went on NBC's Tonight Show to promote Shock Point before the new year. Do you still remember? That day, you just came back from Colorado. We stayed up late and just happened to see the show that day. I remember now, but Catherine Bigelow looks so young. Didn't they say that she was in her 30s? 39 years old." Charlotte wiped her face with some envy and said, "If I could still be so beautiful at this age, I would wake up laughing in my dreams." While the two women were gossiping about Eric and Catherine were in the car returning to the hotel. The woman did not say a word for a long time. Eric finally could not help but ask, "What are you thinking about?" Catherine glanced at Eric and did not hide her thoughts. She said, "I'm thinking about staying away from you. You're too dangerous. In less than an hour, you coaxed those two girls to do anything." Eric said, "Maybe they recognized me. You have to know that I'm very rich. This is a good opportunity for an ordinary girl at the bottom of the metropolis. The short-haired girl recognized you, but the ponytail girl didn't. However, she didn't reject the short-haired girl's hint." Catherine easily pointed out the crux of the matter. "Of course, this has nothing to do with me. What's important is..." The woman raised her wrist and looked at her watch. "It's already 10:15. When I'm not working, I'll rest at 10 o'clock. This is the rule I set for myself. Also, before this, I've never been to a nightclub. I've never worn a white scarf. Before dinner, Becky secretly pointed at my scarf and asked me what happened. I didn't know how to explain it." Eric couldn't help but rub his nose and say, "It sounds very serious." "Of course it's very serious. Human nature is very strong. It takes years to build a rigorous lifestyle, but it may only take a week of indulgence to destroy it." "I didn't take you to indulge, did I?" Catherine looked at Eric with a complicated gaze. "Thinking of the age gap between them," she said, "being with you is a kind of indulgence in itself." Eric argued, "But you were the one who invited me today. I regret it." For some reason, after hearing Catherine's words, Eric suddenly thought of a certain Lolita's righteous words of $20. It seemed that no matter how old a woman was, being unreasonable was a talent. However, occasionally throwing a tantrum was also a cute thing about women. Catherine did not know what Eric was thinking. After saying this, she turned her face and looked out of the car window. The two did not speak until they arrived at Soheo Hotel. They walked into the elevator together and arrived at the floor where Catherine lived. The woman took a few steps but did not immediately leave the elevator. She turned around and blocked the elevator door. She said to Eric, "Sorry, Eric, I just overreacted. I shouldn't have said that." Eric exaggeratedly covered his heart. "You scared me to death. I thought you would never talk to me again. As a consolation, shouldn't there be a hug before saying good night?" The little bit of guilt that just rose in Catherine's heart disappeared when she saw Eric's expression. This little pervert. With a faint smile on her lips, the woman glared at Eric and left the elevator without looking back. Early in the morning, Catherine came to the restaurant on time as usual. Eric was already sitting there. The woman's footsteps were a little hesitant, but Eric looked up and smiled. "Are you really going to draw the line with me?" Catherine also felt that she had overreacted. She walked over and sat down across from Eric. After eating breakfast together, Eric asked the waiter to clean up the table and said to Catherine, "I'm going back to Los Angeles today." "When do you plan to go back?" Catherine seemed to be relieved. She asked casually, "I plan to stay for another month and go back at the end of February." "Are you done with your work?" "The war in the Middle East has begun to end. Everything has been settled. I don't need to stay here anymore. Also, I need to start preparing for my next movie. Is it the tornado that you mentioned before? Eric smiled and said, Yes, I'm starting to prepare now. It'll be produced this year and released next summer. 1 year, that's a long time. Eric explained, in the future, when special effects movies become mainstream in Hollywood, you'll find that the cycle is not long at all. In fact, this is also a kind of monopoly in disguise. As the investment in movies becomes larger and larger, the production cycle becomes longer and longer. Those production companies with extremely low risk tolerance will be eliminated in large batches. Only a few major Hollywood studios can support this kind of movie project. Catherine said, Why are you telling me this? I'm not interested. Eric just wanted to tell the woman across from him a fact. In his memory, all of Catherine's works were toxic movies. At the same time, it also caused her to spend a lot of time on the financing process for each of her works. Okay, let's get down to business. Eric handed a thick folder in front of Catherine. This is the script for Saving Private Ryan. I made some changes according to the results of our discussion when we were filming Point Shock. When I was free, I also took some time to draw some split scenes. There are a total of 76 scenes. You can use them as a reference. When Catherine heard that Eric had drawn 76 split scenes, she could not help but open it to take a look. She had seen Eric's split scenes drafts in the study room at the Shop Corner Manor. But when she opened it to take a look, the style of these drawings was very different from the one she had seen at that time. It looked very sloppy, but she could easily distinguish the relevant scenes. It's so ugly, the woman said with a smile. Eric said, If I have enough time, I can also draw it as precise as an industrial design like you. Catherine flipped through the drawings in her hand and said, But I don't think I've agreed to take on this movie yet, right? Then you can think about it while you watch it, Eric said. But you can imagine that if you can even make a historical war film that female directors rarely touch and win enough praise and box office sales, then you won't be treated differently in Hollywood because of your gender in the future, right? When Catherine heard Eric's words, she paused for a moment. She was obviously very tempted. After thinking for a moment, the woman quickly made up her mind. All right, I'll take on this movie. But you mustn't interfere too much. I don't want others to take credit for the movie after it's finished. Eric smiled and said, Of course, no problem. I can find you another producer. Chapter 404. Speaking of the producer, Catherine Bigelow couldn't help but say, Why do we need to find another producer? I can do it myself. Eric smiled in surprise. Your proposal is really bold. For a project with an investment of more than $50 million, not many directors in Hollywood dare to confidently ask to be the producer themselves. They will often lose their jobs as directors. Catherine also seemed to think that her request was a bit too much. In Hollywood, it was a very important rule that directors were restricted by producers. The final editing rights of most movies were often in the hands of producers. This could prevent the director from recklessly filming according to his own ideas and affecting the quality of the movie. It also prevented the investor's funds from being squandered by the director. Of course, this rule also had a huge drawback. Many excellent movies were ruined beyond recognition because of the producer's interference. In the end, the movie director was implicated and received bad reviews from the audience. Often, many years later, the movie company would release some director's edits, and the movie would be righted. The most famous example of this was the famous Italian director Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America. Seeing the woman awkwardly stretch out her slender fingers to rub the script in front of her after making the suggestion, Eric smiled and said, Of course, the biggest advantage of Hollywood is that it is more flexible than other industries. If you really want to be the producer of Saving Private Ryan, I can promise you that. Catherine raised her head and asked tentatively, Then, what about the final editing rights? Eric raised his eyebrows. Hey, woman, don't push your luck. Woman. Catherine dragged her voice slightly and repeated Eric's words. You are discriminating. Are you saying that if I were a man, I would get the final editing rights? Eric stared at Catherine's beautiful face that didn't show any signs of aging. If you were a man, you wouldn't even be able to get the position of producer. Catherine couldn't help but avoid Eric's undisguised gaze. I'm warning you, little guy. Don't do this again, or I won't take on this movie. You're starting to lose confidence? Eric suddenly asked. Catherine was puzzled. What? Eric struck a pose that he thought was very cool. He looked at Catherine and said, I mean, you're starting to lose confidence. You're afraid that you won't be able to stand my seduction? Catherine's mouth was slightly agape as she stared at Eric's hateful expression in surprise. She was stunned for a few seconds before she abruptly stood up, picked up the folder in front of her, and mercilessly smacked Eric's head a few times. Little bastard. Narcissist. Eric took a few hits and leaned back on the chair to avoid the woman's attack range. Looking at Catherine's rare loss of composure, he laughed out loud. The two of them were originally sitting in the conspicuous seats near the center of the restaurant. Catherine suddenly stood up and attacked Eric, immediately attracting the attention of all the customers in the restaurant. Feeling the strange gazes, Catherine, who was holding the folder, instantly seemed to be dyed with a layer of delicate wine red. She mechanically retracted her outstretched arms little by little, put down the folder in her hand, and hurriedly turned around and walked out of the restaurant. Eric looked at the woman's back as she fled, and the smile on the corner of his mouth deepened. Ignoring other people's pointing fingers, Eric picked up the folder opposite him and got up to follow her. Catherine returned to her room and went into the bathroom to wash her face with cold water. Only then did the feeling on her cheeks slowly recede. Looking at herself in the mirror with a few strands of wet hair on her forehead, the woman patted her face gently to speed up the dissipation of the blush on her cheeks. She muttered to herself, "Despicable guy, despicable, little guy." She was muttering to herself in the mirror when the door was suddenly knocked. She wiped her face with a towel and walked out. Thinking that it might be Eric outside the door, she stood behind the door and hesitated for a few seconds. Only then did she realize that she couldn't show her fear because of a few words of ridicule from him. That would make him even more proud. Yes, she definitely couldn't let that little guy be even more proud. He even said something like, seduction. How arrogant and narcissistic. After giving herself a pep talk, Catherine pulled the door open, but blocked the door and didn't let Eric in. Her eyes turned cold, and she raised her chin slightly. What do you want now? Eric looked at the woman's proud posture, handed the folder over, and said jokingly, Your Majesty, you left something in the restaurant. Catherine looked at the folder in Eric's hand, but she didn't have any intention of taking it. Give it to someone else, Eric didn't wait for the woman to finish and stuffed the script into Catherine's arms. Seeing that she took it in a panic and wanted to push it back, Eric took a step back and said, Okay, it's just a joke. Study the script well. Since you want to be a producer, come up with a detailed production plan as soon as possible. If there's nothing else, I'm leaving. Because this time, they were much more prepared than in August, Eric didn't need to stay in New York for too long. Chris alone was enough to control the situation, and Eric still had a lot of things to do. It was always troublesome to deal with related matters remotely. On February 5th, Eric returned to Los Angeles again after staying in New York for more than half a month. Of course, because many institutions and investors were prepared this time, although they invested $2 billion, the ratio of profit was not as high as last time because of the reduction of leverage and the increase of players in the futures market. According to Chris's statistics, the final profit from the crude oil futures market this time was about $4 billion. However, with the profit from last August, Eric would have a huge amount of funds of nearly $8 billion in his hands after all the transactions were completed. This money was more than enough to fully acquire Disney, and maybe he could do something else while he was at it. In Los Angeles, since the end of last year, the annual award season had come to an end with the Golden Globe Awards. Because of the war, the award season in Hollywood this year was not as lively as in previous years. For the sake of public image, even the Golden Globe Awards were held in a low-key manner. However, now that the outcome of the war had been decided, the Oscar Awards ceremony on March 24th would be as grand as in previous years. Although Eric did not participate in the Golden Globe Awards on January 19th, he had been paying attention to the situation here. At the Golden Globe Awards, the two most important works related to Firefly were Ghost and Friends. Not only did Whoopi Goldberg win the Best Supporting Actress in a Musical Comedy, but to Eric's surprise, Nicolas Cage, who replaced Patrick Swayze as Sam, also won the Best Actor in a Musical Comedy. However, in Eric's view, although Cage's acting was impeccable, the public relations component of this award was more important. In addition to Firefly's public relations, the Coppola family's connections must have played a big role. As for the second season of Friends, which still received a lot of praise and high ratings, not only did it win the Best Series in a Musical Comedy, but Jennifer Aniston also won the Best Actress in a Musical Comedy. It was a pity that Eric did not attend. Otherwise, he would definitely run into Stubborn Girl, whom he had not seen in a long time. Although Elizabeth's The Silence of the Lambs was recognized as an Oscar favorite and even had a slight tendency to overshadow Francis Coppola's The Godfather 3, it did not seem to be favored by the judges at the Golden Globe Awards. Although the nominations were similar to the Oscar nominations that were announced later, only Jodie Foster won the Best Actress award. All the other awards were left empty. This result made Elizabeth nervous for a while. She even called Eric to discuss it with him in New York. However, the public relations focus of The Silence of the Lambs had always been on the Oscars. The Golden Globe Awards were not that important. Moreover, although the Golden Globe Awards were known as the outpost of the Oscars, it was not the Golden Globe Awards that really reflected the trend of the Oscars. Instead, it was the special awards of the Directors Guild, Screen Actors Guild, and Screenwriters Guild. In these awards, The Silence of the Lambs had already won a lot, so Eric was sure that there would not be too many twists and turns in this year's Oscars. Logically speaking, The Godfather 3 should have been a big threat, but that was not the case. Because of Eric's accidental interference, Sofia Coppola, who had received a lot of bad reviews in the previous life, voluntarily withdrew from the cast of The Godfather 3. Francis Coppola invited a young actress with good acting skills, Winona Reed. However, this change was destined to not be able to save The Godfather 3, which was a bit of a sloppy sequel. Many people knew that Coppola did not have any plans to make The Godfather 3. However, because the film company run by Coppola's family had a huge loss 2 years ago, Coppola had to agree to Paramount Pictures to make the sequel. It was said that Coppola originally planned to release the film on Easter next year, but because of Paramount Pictures' repeated urging, the film was pushed forward by more than 3 months. Correspondingly, because the production period was shortened, the sequel was not as good as the first 2 films. So far, The Godfather 3 had only earned $60 million at the box office. According to the current attendance rate, it would definitely not be able to last until the Oscars to enjoy the box office rebound. Because of this, Paramount did not seem to be very enthusiastic about the Godfather 3 awards. Although Coppola did not say anything publicly, in private, he was quite dissatisfied with Paramount's decision to speed up the production process, which affected the film's quality. Therefore, he was not in the mood to do PR. Although the first 2 films in the Godfather series had won Best Picture, the quality of The Godfather 3 was completely incomparable to the first 2 films. In this case, the chances of it winning Best Picture were even slimmer. Also, because Eric interfered with Dances with Wolves, there was no film that could compete with The Silence of the Lambs in this year's Oscars. After returning to Los Angeles, Eric only asked a little about this before he put most of his energy into the subsequent restructuring of Firefly and the preparation of Tornado. After all, even if The Silence of the Lambs won an award, on the surface, it did not seem to have much to do with Eric. As for Ghost, although it was nominated for Best Picture, Eric had no intention of doing PR at all. Firefly only put some energy into Whoopi Goldberg's Best Supporting Actress and Best Original Screenplay awards. Although Bridget Fonda and Cage were both nominated for the Golden Globe, neither of them was nominated for the Oscars. After half a year, the development of the special effects software, Maya, led by Ed Kamal, had reached the final testing stage. Of course, this was only the traditional 1.0 version. Its main function was to satisfy the special effects of Tornado. During the production of Tornado, there would be continuous investment to improve it. The fluid simulation software that was given to a research team at Stanford University in Stan had been completed. It was connected with Maya and the rendering software, RenderMan. This software was specially used to design fluid special effects such as hurricanes and waves, which could make these scenes look more realistic. After the initial problems with the special effects were solved, Tornado began the early stage of casting. Of course, Eric had already decided on the female lead, Joanna Pakula. This could not be changed. However, the male lead and the supporting actress, as well as the many supporting roles in the movie, had become the targets of competition for major agencies. Many people in the Hollywood circle knew that CAA and Eric had some conflicts. The third Home Alone movie had been delayed because of CAA's insistence on a large salary. However, CAA took the initiative to contact Eric this time, trying to get the male lead and supporting actress roles in Tornado. Many people could see that CAA was taking the initiative to express their goodwill. Because of the tripartite situation of the Hollywood agencies, CAA, WMA, and ICM, CAA was not as glorious as it was in his previous life. Michael Ovitz was also ranked outside the top 5 on the Hollywood Power Rankings at the end of last year. If it had been 2 years ago, Eric would have been calculative about his conflict with CAA. However, he no longer cared. He had set his sights on the entire Hollywood. CAA was no longer the giant that all the Hollywood studios in his previous life feared. In the past 2 years, there had been no rumors of CAA agents barging into the senior offices of major film companies. Therefore, in the face of CAA's goodwill, Eric generously asked the assistant director in charge of casting to accept the resumes. Eric's movies were already recognized as star-making machines. Almost every one of his previous movies had produced an A-list Hollywood superstar. With Eric's production cut, the competition for roles related to Tornado reached an extremely high level. After the casting of Tornado was revealed, not only CAA, but the other 2 agencies, WMA and ICM, also did not hesitate. Even some second- and third-tier agencies joined in, trying to get some supporting roles. Therefore, as long as they had connections with Eric in a roundabout way, they would try to contact Eric himself. After all, Eric had the final say on the roles. Chapter 405. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At Firefly's headquarters, the meeting to discuss Firefly's development plan for the next 2 years had been going on for a whole day. After Robert Shea's departure, after 2 months of reorganization and integration, Firefly was now like a newly modified sports car that was on the fast track. Therefore, in the conference room, whether it was the veterans of Firefly or the new executives who had just been integrated into the big family, they were all in a state of excitement with a vision for the future. The day-long meeting did not bring them the slightest tiredness. So far, Eric's plan to annex Disney was only known to himself and Jeffrey and his son. Moreover, to annex an industry giant like Disney, even if it started in the second half of this year, even if everything went smoothly, it would take at least a year. Later on, it would take even longer to integrate Disney into Firefly's system. Therefore, the development of Firefly itself was still the top priority. Firefly's core business was currently only 2 major areas, film and television. In terms of television business, before he had his own television station, Eric had no intention of expanding. As long as he managed the 3 television programs in his hands well, the profits brought were enough to make any production company envious. Therefore, today's discussion was about Firefly's film production plan for the next 2 years. Among the 7 major Hollywood film companies, except for the half-dead MGM, the other 6 released about 10 to 20 films a year. The films they invested in often accounted for half of this number. Although Firefly already had the potential to be on par with the 7 major companies, the road also needed to be taken step by step. Therefore, Eric planned to complete the production and distribution of 5 films this year and expand this number to 8 to 10 next year. In the future, it may need to be planned together with Disney. The expansion of the production scale also meant the increase of the investment risk of the film. However, for Eric, who had a golden finger, this problem was not a problem at all. Although he could not intervene in every film, Eric had absolute veto power in the initial review stage of the project. In this way, he could minimize the production risk of Firefly's films. It was not without any benefits to lose a few projects. This could make Hollywood relax its vigilance against Firefly. After discussing the last topic, the new CEO, Michael Lynn, turned his head and whispered to Eric, who was sitting on his right, "Eric, do you have anything to add?" Eric closed the memo in front of him and said, "That's all. Let's carry out today's resolution as soon as possible." Michael Lynn nodded and announced the adjournment of the meeting to the department heads in the conference room. Watching Eric leave the conference room with his assistant, Michael Lynn hesitated and did not chase after them. Instead, he stopped Jeffrey, who was also leaving, and said, "Jeffrey, wait for me." Jeffrey stopped and waited for Michael Lynn to walk side by side with him before he began to walk out. "Michael, what's the matter? Are you free tonight? Let's have dinner together?" Michael Lynn asked. Jeffrey looked at Michael Lynn's expression and asked with a smile, "Michael, if you have something to say, just say it. You don't have to be so polite. Why don't we go to my office?" "Okay." Michael Lynn smiled and followed Jeffrey to his CEO's office. The two of them sat down on the sofa in the corner of the office. Jeffrey instructed his secretary to make coffee for the two of them. He then said with a smile, "Is there something at work that you're too embarrassed to tell Eric, so you want me to pass on the message? Actually, you don't have to be so cautious. You should understand that if it weren't for the irreconcilable differences between Robert and Eric, Eric wouldn't have done that at all. As long as you think about Firefly wholeheartedly, he won't be angry if you mention anything in front of him." When Michael Lynn heard Jeffrey's words, he remembered his purpose and his expression became a little awkward. He said, "Of course I know this. In fact, I called you for a small matter." Jeffrey paused and suddenly probed, "Don't tell me it's also about the casting for Tornado? Even you've been contacted?" Michael Lynn coughed a few times and said, "It was Mike Tanner from WMA who came to me personally. I owed him a big favor before, so it's not easy to refuse." Jeffrey also understood Michael Lynn's difficulties and said, "Show me the list." Michael Lynn took out a note from his suit pocket and handed it over. Jeffrey took it and looked at it. He shook his head and said with a smile, "Even John Travolta is here. They want to get the male lead role?" I also explained to Mike Tanner that Tornado is a movie focused on special effects, but he said that as long as he gets the role, the salary can be negotiated. Jeffrey said, "The total budget of Tornado is only $5 million. Eric planned to use second and third tier actors from the beginning. He paid Ms. Pakula $300,000, so the male lead role will probably be the same figure." John Travolta's box office hit $100 million last year in One Flew Over Childhood, and he is still an A-list star. Even if he reduces his salary, it won't be too much. As for the plan of converting his salary into shares, it's even more impossible, so Eric will definitely not use him. If he wants to use an A-list actor, Tom Hanks is also available. His agent also contacted Eric, but Eric refused. Michael Lynn smiled and said, "I know that, but I'm only responsible for handing the list to you. Even if I return Mike Tanner's favor, I don't promise him anything else." "Well, I'll ask Eric to call Mike Tanner of WMA in person. Eric will still give you face. Even CAA began to show goodwill to us some time ago. I guess WMA mainly wants to establish contact with Eric so that they can cooperate in the future." Michael Lynn relaxed and said, "That's the best. If Eric comes forward, Mike Tanner's favor will be completely returned. I won't owe him anything in the future." The Hollywood film industry had developed for hundreds of years. Although the system was very sound, it was only a relative concept. Connections still played a vital role in Hollywood. Otherwise, there would not be a situation where Jews controlled most of Hollywood's resources. Eric received a call from Jeffrey in the car back to Malibu. He also chatted with Michael Lynn for a while and agreed. In fact, whether it was the news released by Firefly or the reviews of various professional magazines in Hollywood, they all made a detailed analysis of the role of actors in Eric's Tornado, which focused on special effects. Although most people knew that no matter how big the actors were, they would be reduced to supporting roles in Tornado in this movie, it could not stop the enthusiasm of many actors to pursue the role in this movie. According to the results of Eric's previous movies, as long as Tornado, which he personally directed, was not too bad, the global box office would definitely be guaranteed to be $300 million. According to the average ticket price of $10, it was equivalent to the actors being familiar in front of 30 million people. As long as they were remembered by an audience of this size, other film companies would be happy to use these actors who were familiar with the audience and were cheap and good actors. Those actors who participated in Tornado were equivalent to holding an iron rice bowl. They would not lack film contracts in the next few years. If they were lucky enough to star in a popular movie, they would successfully join the ranks of the A-list stars. At present, Tornado was mainly casting second- and third-tier Hollywood actors. This was an excellent opportunity for actors who wanted to make a name for themselves. It was no wonder that so many people contacted Eric in a roundabout way. Back at the Shop Corner Manor, the security guard at the gate told Eric that Drew was back. As soon as Eric walked into the villa, the little girl, who heard the noise, stood up from the sofa on the other side of the hall. She looked at Eric with her little arms on the back of the sofa. Her long eyelashes fluttered and there was a sweet smile on her tender face. Eric walked over and pinched the little girl's face. Pretending to be cute. "Why are you back today?" Drew asked. "Eric, did you forget something?" Eric took off his jacket and hung it on the hanger beside him. He walked to the sofa and sat down. He relaxed and leaned against the back of the chair. "Go get me a glass of water. I'll think about it after drinking it." The little girl pounced on Eric like a wild cat. Her two little white legs, which were wearing hot pants, were still rubbing against Eric. "Think about it first. We'll talk about it when you remember. You're so inconsiderate." "Okay, let me think." Eric rubbed his temples. Amidst the little girl's anticipation, he quickly showed a look of realization. He raised his hand and patted the little girl's white and tender thigh. "I remember now. Quentin Tarantino, that bastard, hasn't finished the script this month again. He probably won't be able to finish the 5 films he owes Firefly for the next 10 years. I'll personally call him tomorrow to hurry him up." Seeing Drew's eyes flicker a few times and a layer of mist suddenly appear in them, Eric quickly smiled and said, Okay. It's your 16th birthday. How could I forget?" "Not only that. What else?" "Also, according to California law, you can be financially independent at the age of 16. You won't be tied down by your mother anymore." "What else?" "You can drive now." "No, that's not it. You promised me back then." Eric hugged the little girl's slender waist and said, "You don't have to say it out loud. The walls have ears. This is California." Drew leaned on Eric and whispered into his ear, "Eric, let's go to Las Vegas on my birthday, okay? I have to call my private lawyer first. I'm not too sure about Nevada's laws. I've called Edward." Eric was a little surprised. "What did you say?" "Just say it. It's not a big deal." Eric pushed the little girl who was leaning on him. "Okay, hurry up and get me a glass of water. It's so awkward to discuss this kind of thing with you in such a serious manner. Besides, I've seen everything on your body. Sigh, it's not fresh anymore." Drew angrily hit Eric and reluctantly got up to pour a glass of water for Eric. Eric took a few sips from the glass and asked, "Have you and Liz decided on TG's next movie?" "Yeah, we picked 4 scripts, but we only got 2. The other 2 were snatched by Paramount and Columbia. The price of the 2 scripts we got also increased by a lot." Liz was furious. Eric could imagine that scene. Although he didn't interfere at all this time and didn't even know what kind of scripts the girls chose, other people wouldn't think so. The Big 7 would definitely think that these scripts went through his hands. If it weren't for his relationship with Elizabeth, Fox probably wouldn't hesitate to jump out and fight for them. 2 is enough. Making 2 movies a year is more than enough for TG. Drew sat down beside Eric and said, "I think so too. By the way, Eric, I've already completed the withdrawal procedures. From now on, I'll focus on studying to be a film producer with Liz." Eric already knew about this. The principal of the boarding school called Eric after the girl made the application. Since the little girl wasn't in the mood to study, Eric sent her to the boarding school and she didn't stay there for more than a few months. Then that's it. You can't continue studying anyway. Your mother didn't say anything, right? Drew pursed his lips. What can she say? She's worried that she won't be able to get a single cent from me after my 16th birthday. She's been nagging me these days about how hard it was for her to raise me. I was clearly the one who raised the family since I was 6 months old, okay? Anyway, after my birthday, I'll move out of the house. I've already bought a small villa in Beverly with the money from The Silence of the Lambs. It's right next to Liz's new house. Liz's? You mean her and Julia? They're still living together? Yeah, don't you know? Drew asked rhetorically. Oh, when you were in New York some time ago, they moved. Also, they have an extra child at home. When Drew said this, his expression became strange. Eric thought of something and asked, "What's going on?" Drew quickly proved Eric's guess. Julia's brother and his girlfriend had a little girl. Neither of them wanted to raise her, so Julia adopted the child. The news hasn't been revealed yet, but Julia will probably make an official statement after a while. After all, if she doesn't say anything, people will definitely think that the child is her illegitimate daughter. Then it'll be a big deal. Then, what's the little girl's name? Emma, Drew said, lying on Eric with a smile. They're going to call the little girl Emma Roberts Murdoch. Wow! Eric was so surprised that he almost dropped the cup in his hand. Emma Roberts Murdoch, are you sure? Surprised, right? Anyway, they're going to register the name for the little girl. The smile on Drew's face became even weirder. They're obviously not gay, but they just don't want to admit it. I think if you go over and teach them a few more lessons, they'll face reality. Eric laughed. Forget it, I won't get involved. Let them be. I just don't know what Mr. Murdoch will think when he finds out that he has a little granddaughter. Drew also laughed. Actually, I suggested to them that the little girl should have another name. What name? Drew rolled his eyes and kept them in suspense before saying, Emma Roberts Murdoch Williams. Eric spat out a mouthful of water and quickly took out a tissue from the coffee table in front of him to wipe it. That's too reckless. Although he said that, he was thinking about something else. In his memory, Emma Roberts was spoiled by Julia into a little witch. She was petite, but she was a violent maniac who would beat her boyfriend until his face was swollen. Julia alone spoiled her to this extent. If this little girl was really given the surnames Roberts, Murdoch, and Williams, she would probably turn Hollywood upside down in the future. Eric pinched the girl's face and pulled it. He laughed and scolded, "Why don't you add your Barrymore in the middle? Emma Roberts Murdoch Barrymore Williams. What a domineering name." Drew broke free from Eric's demonic hands and suddenly said, "Why didn't I think of that? I'll discuss it with them tomorrow." The girl obviously treated this as a fun thing. Eric was too lazy to pay attention to it. Anyway, he felt that Elizabeth and Julia would not agree, so let her be. Chapter 406. In the end, the trip to Las Vegas that Drew proposed did not happen. Not to mention that Eric could not leave at all. Even if he was free, with his and Drew's age, they would not be able to do anything. Although Las Vegas was considered a city of sin, the laws were actually stricter. There was even a curfew system. Moreover, any young people under the age of 21 were not allowed to gamble or drink there. Eric would not turn 21 until May, and Drew was even younger. Since they could not go to Las Vegas, Eric discussed with Xia Xiaoluo and decided to hold a birthday party at the Pointy Corner Manor. Although Americans only had a coming-of-age ceremony at the age of 18, for the precocious Drew, her 16th birthday was already her coming-of-age ceremony. Therefore, Xia Xiaoluo attached great importance to this birthday party and had been personally organizing it these days. After the news of another party at the Pointy Corner Manor in Malibu was revealed, it caused quite a stir in Hollywood. This was the second large-scale party held at the Pointy Corner Manor. The first time was more than a year ago when Eric had just moved into the manor. Because the rise of Firefly was unstoppable, more and more people wanted to befriend Eric. Therefore, Xia Xiaoluo's birthday party became the focus of the entire Hollywood. Many people who had contact with Eric once or twice took the initiative to call to ask for an invitation. While many of the main and supporting roles in Tornado were still undecided, those who wanted to get in touch with Eric directly but couldn't find a way to do so were even more desperate to find out about the party invitation. This morning, with the mediation of the Soviet Union, Iraq has made a detailed withdrawal plan. There will be no more waves in this war. It feels incredible. This is probably the fastest war the Federation has fought in decades. In the study of the villa, Jeffrey, who came to the manor early, sat on the sofa and said with emotion. Eric placed a cup of coffee in front of Jeffrey and sat down opposite him. Yeah, it feels like it was premeditated. When I was in New York, I noticed something strange. In this war, Saudi Arabia and other countries not only reimbursed more than $10 billion of military expenses, but the federal government also made more than $100 billion from this war through the crude oil contract. With such huge profits, I think some people will want to fight again. Jeffrey didn't notice the hidden meaning in Eric's words. Instead, he asked in a low voice, "How's Chris doing?" "All the contracts will be settled before the end of the month. Chris has already given me a more detailed statistics. It's about $1 billion, and the specific fluctuations will not exceed $100 million. The oil price has now dropped to $18. It can't drop any further." Jeffrey took a deep breath and said, "Plus the last time, it's $8 billion. If you include the Firefly, your net worth is now $10 billion. TSK, at your age, this number can enter the Guinness Book of Records. It's definitely a record that will be difficult to break." However, Eric said, "Pure money is nothing. How to convert money into power, and power is the most important thing." Jeffrey smiled and said, "Hearing you say that, I suddenly feel a little excited. I really want to see how far you can go in the end." Eric said confidently, "It won't take too long. Maybe 10 years, at most 20 years. As the two were chatting casually, the door of the study opened. Drew, who was wearing a pink dress and high heels, walked in. "Eric, there are more and more guests. I can't handle it. Just say hello and be polite. I don't need you to accompany me all the time. What's there to be busy about?" Eric moved aside and let the little girl sit beside him. Drew waved her hand to fan herself. "If I had known, I wouldn't have invited so many people. Now there are more than 200 people here, and there are still people rushing here." Although the little girl said so, there was a smile on her face. Obviously, she was very satisfied with the scale of the party. Eric frowned slightly and thought for a while. He said, "Tell Carter to strengthen the inspection of the manor. Don't let anyone make any trouble. Most importantly, don't let irrelevant people in. I've thought about this for a long time." I also asked Carter to temporarily borrow 30 security guards from the headquarters of his security company. The invitations at the gate are also very strict. Eric nodded and looked at his watch. "The more important people are almost here. Let's go out. Jeffrey, do you want to stay here?" Jeffrey also stood up. "No need. Maybe we can meet an acquaintance and chat." The three of them left Eric's study and came to the hall. At this time, the hall of the mansion was already crowded. Men in decent clothes and women in gorgeous dresses came and went, whispering in groups of 3 to 5. It seemed orderly and there was no sense of chaos at all. As soon as Eric appeared, he became the focus of everyone's attention. The guests who were closer to Eric took the initiative to come over and greet him. Drew held Eric's arm intimately. She didn't care that the man beside her was the focus of everyone's attention. She knew that Eric was the main reason why these people could come to the party. After a round of social interaction in the hall, a bodyguard received news that the manor's gate was open. He came over and whispered a few words in Eric's ear. Eric then walked out of the villa with Drew. The sky was slowly darkening, but a large number of colorful lights in the manor had been lit up, setting off the entire manor like a fantasy kingdom. "Eric, who's here?" Drew asked softly. "Francis Coppola." Eric had just finished speaking when he saw Coppola coming over with his daughter, Sophia, and Cage. Eric went up to them with a smile. "Frank, I didn't expect you to come personally today." Eric hugged Coppola, greeted Cage, and shook hands with Sophia Coppola. He looked at the girl in a white evening dress and said, "Sophia, you're really beautiful tonight." "Drew is also very beautiful." Sophia smiled politely. She nodded at Eric and greeted Drew. After a few words, Eric saw Amy Pascal walking over with a man. Looking at how close they were, the man was probably Pascal's husband. Amy Pascal was now the vice president of Columbia, but since Dark War, the two sides had not cooperated. But compared to companies like Warner Brothers and MGM, which had never had any interactions, Firefly and Columbia still had some connections. After greeting Amy Pascal, the couple was invited into the villa. After more than half an hour, it was time for the party to start. Almost all the guests had arrived. Eric was about to return to the hall with his little girl when he saw two women walking over together. "Drew, happy birthday." Elizabeth hugged Drew, then pulled the woman beside her and introduced her to Eric. "Eric, this is the female lead of my next movie, Susan Sarandon." Eric smiled and greeted Susan Sarandon. "What a coincidence. We meet again. Susan, I didn't expect you to star in Liz's movie. I thought the script was good, so I took it. But I'm looking forward to working with you again." Susan Sarandon said with a smile and greeted Drew. They returned to the hall side by side. Eric casually asked Elizabeth next to him, "By the way, what's the script for your next movie?" "I still don't know. The script is called Thelma and Louise." "It's a road movie," Elizabeth explained. Eric was stunned. He quickly remembered the movie because it had a very domineering translation, "Flowers at the End of the Road." Flowers at the End of the Road could be regarded as the first work of feminist road movies. It had a great impact. He didn't expect the script to fall into the hands of Elizabeth. However, in his memory, Flowers at the End of the Road should have been produced by MGM. The box office was not bad. In this case, the poor MGM lost another profitable work. Based on the name, there should be two female leads. What about the other one? Elizabeth glanced at Eric and said, "I originally had my eyes on Gina Davis, but because of the mess you created, it's definitely not going to work now. I have to find another female lead." Eric thought for a moment and said, "The X-Files will start filming in June. Famke's image is similar to Gina Davis's. Give her the female lead." Elizabeth thought of the hot Famke Jensen and said with some interest, "Why should I give it to her?" "Beg me." "No problem." Eric looked at the girl with a smile, but there was a dangerous look in his eyes. "Why don't we find a place and I'll beg you alone?" Elizabeth was speechless for a moment. With a blush on her face, she gritted her teeth and said, "You're such a jerk." Chapter 407. Eric, who was holding Drew's arm, saw Spielberg chatting with an unfamiliar guest by the floor-to-ceiling window in Lynn High, so they walked up to them. Seeing Eric walking toward Spielberg, the guest greeted Eric and tactfully left. Eric raised his glass to Spielberg and asked, "Steven, how's the filming of Captain Hawk going? I heard that Sony has built 9 large studios for this film." Spielberg did not seem to be very interested in this topic. Although he had personally visited Eric and obtained some feasible amendments, just as Eric had rejected Spielberg's investment proposal, the script itself had a lot of flaws. As the filming progressed, Spielberg became more and more aware of this. Perhaps Captain Hawk would not lose money, but it would hurt his personal reputation. "It's okay. If nothing unexpected happens, it will be completed in May," Spielberg said. He looked at Drew, who was hanging on Eric's arm, and smiled. "Drew, you're 16 years old now. Gwyneth had a cameo role in Captain Hawk. When are you going to make another movie?" Drew said, "I don't plan to make another movie, Godfather. I'm going to learn how to be a filmmaker. I can help Eric in the future. Spielberg had heard some rumors about The Silence of the Lambs, but like many people, he completely attributed it to Eric. He did not believe that a few women could make such an outstanding movie. He said seriously, "It's not that easy to be a filmmaker. You're still young. Not everyone in Hollywood is as outstanding as Eric." Eric smiled and interrupted, "Stephen, actually, the script for The Silence of the Lambs was bought by Drew from someone else. This little girl has good taste. The production of the movie was done by them. I only helped to take a look at the script." Spielberg knew that there was no need for Eric to lie about such a small matter. He looked at the girl in front of him and revealed a faint look of surprise. "What a surprise." Eric patted Drew on the back and said, "Drew, you haven't seen Stephen for a long time. You must have a lot to talk about. I'll go entertain the other guests." Although they were godfather and goddaughter in name, the relationship between Drew and Spielberg was actually very distant because of various things in the past. If it weren't for Eric, Spielberg wouldn't have attended Drew's birthday party today. The little girl knew that Eric wanted her to mend her relationship with Spielberg in order to accumulate connections for her future development. She obediently stepped forward and held Spielberg's arm, saying, "Godfather, let's go to the outdoor swimming pool. The air there is very good, and it was personally designed and renovated by me." Spielberg waved his hand at Eric and chuckled as he followed the little girl's strength and walked out. Eric watched the two leave and felt a little hungry. Just as he was about to get something to eat, he saw a round fatty very agilely come over before the others. "Harvey, how do you feel tonight? Is it more relaxed than those public relations parties?" Eric greeted him with a smile and pointed at the long buffet table not far away. "Of course. I don't need to waste my breath trying to persuade those stubborn old men here," Harvey Weinstein replied with a smile. Harvey came to the long table and helped Eric get a plate. He also took one for himself and picked up the food on the plate. After taking the food, Eric and Harvey found a table and sat down together. He joked, "Actually, there are quite a few old men from the association here. If they heard what you said just now, all your efforts would have been in vain." Harvey knew that Eric was joking, but he still couldn't help but look around. He relaxed and said, "Eric, you scared me. This award season, I've already spent more than 7 figures on public relations. I heard that Mira Mike's film this year won 5 of the 6 nominations for Best Foreign Film. You guys are really in the limelight now. It's a pity that there aren't any important nominations." Harvey shook his head and sighed. He was obviously very dissatisfied with the result. Eric smiled. He thought of the people in his previous life who had invested hundreds of millions to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, but in the end, they came back empty-handed. He felt that it was ironic. Those people were obsessed with the award, but they didn't know that the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film was like a game to them decades ago. Eric was even a little glad that when he went to film school, he had already missed out on the generation of people who were obsessed with European films. Eric didn't care about the films released by Mira Mike. Instead, he asked, "How's the public relations for The Silence of the Lambs?" Harvey lowered his voice and said, "The Best Film and Best Director awards are in the bag, but the Best Actor and Actress awards are not guaranteed. Although Anthony Hopkins has performed very well, he is still a newcomer to the Oscars. His competitors this time are all very experienced old men. Miss Jodie Foster just won Best Actress 2 years ago, so her chances are not high this time." Eric nodded with satisfaction and said, "Just do your best. I still have a lot of faith in the public relations ability of you two brothers." Harvey showed a look of regret and said, "If only The Silence of the Lambs was released by Mira Mike. That way, we can make a credible plan for this film, and the chances of Best Actor and Actress winning would be higher." Eric only smiled and didn't respond to Harvey's words. Harvey's words were nothing more than a hint that he wanted to work together. However, Firefly, which had just completed its integration, was Eric's top priority. Even if he wanted to cooperate, he wouldn't cooperate with a small company like Mira Mike. Harvey also understood Eric's intention and felt a little regretful. Although the two brothers had found out more and more ways to do public relations for the Oscars, Eric didn't seem to be interested in Mira Mike. Since Eric didn't have the intention to cooperate for the time being, Harvey didn't dare to be too persistent. He just said that if Eric had the intention to cooperate, he could contact him at any time. The two chatted casually. Not long after, Elizabeth came over with a plate and sat down on Eric's left. She joined the conversation, and most of the topics were still about the Silence of the Lambs. Chapter 408. After a while, Harvey left alone. Elizabeth moved closer to Eric and whispered, "Eric, what do you think if I buy Mira Mike?" Eric gestured for a waiter to clear away his plate and asked for a glass of champagne before asking, "Why did you suddenly have this idea?" Elizabeth said, "I heard that Mira Mike lost a lot of money this year. After the success of Sex, Lies, and Videotape and My Left Foot last year, the Wayne-Stan brothers bought more than 10 movies in one go. In the end, not only did most of them fail at the box office, they also didn't win anything at the Oscars. I think this is a good opportunity." "Good opportunity? What good opportunity? What's your purpose in buying Mira Mike? Even if you buy it, do you have any specific plans for Mira Mike? Also, what's TG's development plan? Have you considered these?" Eric's series of questions confused Elizabeth. After the success of The Silence of the Lambs, Elizabeth only wanted to strike while the iron was hot and continue to produce films to develop TG. But as for the specific planning, did a production company like theirs need any sort of planning? Other than making movies, wasn't it still making movies? Okay, let's take it one by one. Eric looked at Elizabeth, who was at a loss. "Why do you want to buy Mira Mike?" "For the Oscars. The two brothers are very good at public relations for the Oscars. Other than helping the public relations for The Silence of the Lambs, they also received 5 nominations for Best Foreign Film. Although there are blockbuster films that make it to the Oscars every year, most of the nominated films are still works of art. Since you want to buy Mira Mike, does that mean you've decided to focus on making indie films that are good for awards?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Of course not, it's just that when needed, you can ask them to do public relations, right? Do you think TG has the ability to buy an indie film company just for the Oscars?" Elizabeth unwillingly moved her waist and used the silver knife in her hand to cut a prawn on the plate in front of her. She muttered, "Fine, I won't buy it." Eric continued, "Actually, most of the time, the Oscars are just icing on the cake. We can't deny that it plays a very important role in the sales of videotapes and so on. The value of the stars who win the Oscars will also multiply. However, out of the hundreds of movies produced in Hollywood every year, only a dozen or so could compete for the Oscars. If the movie company's goal was to compete for the Oscars, then the company would never be able to grow. Orion Pictures, which recently announced that it would stop production, is actually an example. I remember that a few years ago, Orion Pictures received 18 nominations in the last Oscars, but now it is still on the road to bankruptcy." Elizabeth waved her small hand to stop him. "All right, it's just a temporary idea. You don't have to talk so much like an old man. Even my father doesn't talk as much as you." Eric looked at Elizabeth with a hurt expression. "Do you think I would nag on if it was someone unrelated?" Elizabeth's face turned slightly red. Just take it that I was wrong, okay? The Silence of the Lambs is TG's work that made them famous. This is an exception, but then you chose a road movie. I haven't read the script yet, so I won't comment for now. But have you thought about what TG's focus will be in the future when it comes to movies? Elizabeth looked thoughtful. "I really haven't thought about that. I just feel that as long as we can pick out a good script and make a good movie, it will be fine. Of course, my plan for myself is to not make a movie that costs more than $30 million in the next 5 years. This way, the risk can be minimized. Even if we accidentally lose money, it won't be too much. I won't comment on the Big 7. But for Firefly, my plan is for Firefly to make a big-budget movie that focuses on special effects. New Line will be in charge of horror and thriller movies. Flower Pictures will focus on action movies in the future. Pixar will be in charge of animation. Black Ant was an accident, so I don't have a definite position for now. After Eric gave a simple introduction, he looked at Elizabeth. So, what kind of movie do you think TG is suitable for? Elizabeth counted with her delicate little fingers and pondered for a moment. It seems like, if we can't specialize in indie movies, the bigger category would be comedy movies. Finally, he lured this girl into his trap. Eric decisively said, "Then that's it. In the future, TG will specialize in comedy movies. Actually, it's very beneficial to specialize in this genre. Just like how the Wayne and Stan brothers figured out a set of rules for the Oscars, if you guys switch to comedy movies, you can also figure out a suitable path after a long time. Also, comedy movies usually cost very little to produce, so it's very suitable for Poison Productions." Elizabeth seemed to have figured out something else as well. She looked at Eric suspiciously and said, "Why do I feel like this was all arranged by you?" Eric snapped his fingers and gave her a look of praise. "So smart. So, you don't have any objections, right?" Elizabeth asked weakly, "What if I have objections?" Eric looked at Elizabeth with a smile. "See, you used a question, which means that this is just a hypothesis. So, you definitely don't have any objections. Since that's the case, then it's decided. We'll have a good talk about the specific cooperation plan later. Actually, I have a lot of good ideas in mind, but I don't have the energy to implement them. I don't want to hand them over to an outsider, so I'm letting you take advantage of me." Elizabeth stared at Eric for a few seconds and pursed her lips. She silently forked the only remaining prawn on the plate in front of her and stuffed it into Eric's champagne glass as a way of venting. Then, she slumped on the table and knocked on the table gloomily. "Oh my God, how did I meet a shameless guy like you? I'm going crazy." Eric looked at the layer of oil in the glass and sighed. What a waste. Regretfully, he stood up and asked the waiter to get another glass. While he was at it, he also thoughtfully took a glass of wine for the girl next to him. "Come, have a glass of champagne. You should thank me, but I've given you a very, very big gold mine to manage." "I'll fire you." Elizabeth gritted her teeth and glared at Eric. She took the glass of champagne and drank it in one gulp. Chapter 409. No matter how grand a party was, there would always be a time when the music came to an end. At midnight, the guests left one after another. The party company's work was very efficient. It only took an hour to restore the messy party to its original state. As the manor servants and the party company's employees left the villa one after another, the brilliantly lit Freedom City gradually dimmed. The paparazzi floating on the distant sea took photos of the mansion's balcony for an entire night. At this time, they also took their rewards and left silently in their speedboats with satisfaction. After changing out of the party's evening gown, Drew went into the bathroom to take a shower. She dressed herself up nicely and only put on one of Eric's sky blue t-shirts before walking into the bedroom with her legs bare. "Eric, where's my birthday present?" The little girl jumped over and asked coquettishly as she rubbed against Eric's side like a cat. Eric pushed away the little girl's hand that was reaching for the magazine in his hand and said, "Isn't there a room full of things in the storage room downstairs? You won't be able to finish them all tomorrow." "I don't care. I'm asking where's the birthday present you prepared for me?" "Well, I went around Rodeo Avenue. The things there were too expensive, so I couldn't bear to buy it." Seeing the little girl's teary face, Eric continued, "So, I made one myself." After Eric finished speaking, he took out a beautifully packaged small box from under the pillow behind him and handed it to Drew. The little girl couldn't wait to open the box and take out the item. In the solid wood picture frame that was slightly smaller than a 32-page book, there was a small sketch. A girl with a tender face wearing a t-shirt that exposed her navel and hot pants was standing on a wide street, smiling as she looked at the people passing by on both sides. In addition, there was a pair of wings on the girl's back, which were painted light gray. The lines in the picture were very slender. Although the whole picture was only the size of an ordinary photo, even the girl's fingers and the feathers on her wings in the picture were very lifelike. It was obvious that a lot of thought had been put into it. Drew looked at the picture frame in his hand and grinned. He was obviously very satisfied, but he still pointed at the girl's wings in the picture and said, "Eric, why are they gray?" "Because the color gray symbolizes loss." Eric looked at the girl's smooth blonde hair in his arms and recalled the many memories he had about Drew before he was reborn, as well as the bits and pieces after they met in this life. With a smile on his lips, he slowly said, "The lost angels with gray wings are not like the pure angels who carry a mission and are bound by shackles. They are also different from the evil and Chen Luan who chopped down the angels. They only lived for their own happiness. They were uninspired and did not love the world. They were willful and indifferent. God was jealous of their freedom, so he said that they were too selfish and banished them to the world. I happened to pick up one and got entangled with it, so I drew her out to remind myself not to make the same mistake again." Drew leaned against Eric's chest and listened quietly. Unknowingly, a glimmer of light flashed in her eyes. After Eric finished speaking, she threw away the picture frame in her hand and threw herself on Eric's body. The next day happened to be Saturday. The girl took the initiative to let the two of them sleep until 4 or 5 in the morning. When Eric woke up, it was already 10 in the morning. Drew even got up in the afternoon. Eric spent the rest of February preparing for Tornado. After many rounds of auditions, all the main roles in the movie were confirmed. By the beginning of March, the breakdown of the movie's script, the production schedule, the preparation of the budget, and the hiring of actors and staff were all completed. In a studio at Digital Domain's headquarters in Venice Beach, Eric and many technical staff waited patiently in front of a small computer. A special effects artist sitting in front of the computer skillfully operated the machine in front of him. A moment later, a playback window appeared on the computer screen. The special effects artist operated the mouse and pressed the play button. In the silent image, there was a wooden house standing alone in the wilderness. The surroundings of the house were all shown with a gray background. This house, which was difficult to distinguish between real and fake, looked a little strange. However, everyone present knew that this house was completely CG. After complicated material rendering, it looked difficult to distinguish between real and fake. Therefore, no one made a fuss about it. However, everyone was excited about the success of their design. Even a few months ago, they were not sure if pure CG effects could reach a level where it was difficult to distinguish between real and fake. However, no one doubted it now. A second after the still image of the house appeared, a gray tornado suddenly appeared on the left side of the image and swept toward the house. As the tornado's tentacles came into contact with the house, the wooden house began to shake and gradually break down. Although the image was still and silent, the onlookers seemed to hear the howling of the tornado and the crackling sound of the house being torn apart by the wind. A few seconds later, the house was destroyed by the tornado, leaving only the foundation of the house in ruins. After the short 8-second scene finished playing, everyone in the studio spontaneously applauded. Cameron was originally working on the post-production of Terminator 2 in the digital field. When he heard that there was something good to see, coupled with Eric's personal visit to the studio, Cameron came over out of curiosity. He did not expect to see the amazing scene in front of him. As a director who was passionate about technology, Cameron understood the technical content of this short 8-second scene better than anyone else. After the scene ended, Cameron patted Eric on the shoulder and said, "It's unbelievable. I didn't expect this to be completely produced by computer special effects. If I didn't know about this beforehand, I would definitely think that the house was real." The scene of the house being destroyed by the tornado is even more shocking. On the other side, Stan Winston sighed. "It's too expensive. This 8-second scene cost $3 million. It's enough to make a good low-budget movie. What's more, it's a pity that this scene can't be used in the movie." Eric watched the special effects artist play the scene again and breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. As long as the effect could be realized, it would be fine. As for the money spent, according to the current situation, it was completely worth it. When making this material, Eric instructed the special effects artist to make this scene according to the highest specifications. Although the picture was not complete and there were no other scenes around the house, this short 8-second scene made the rendering farm that the digital field had just invested $10 million to build work at full capacity for 16 hours. The power consumption of the rendering farm's huge processor cluster alone burned more than $100,000. However, at this time, after seeing the realistic effect displayed by the computer CG scene, Eric did not feel the slightest pity for investing $3 million in this 8-second scene. He was as excited as the special effects artists beside him. The result of this scene at least proved that all the money and energy he had invested in the past year was worth it. Okay, Stan, this investment is necessary. If we can't accurately test the feasibility of the tornado CG scene, there's no need to make the movie. Come, let's go to your office and talk. Chapter 4:10. Stan Winston nodded and followed Eric out of the studio. Cameron reluctantly looked at the computer surrounded by a group of special effects artists and also followed them out. He caught up to Eric and put his arm around his shoulder. Eric, I suddenly had a great idea. It's about Terminator 2, you see. Eric knew very well that Cameron must have seen the special effects just now and thought of another idea. He immediately said with a bitter face, Jim, don't even think about it. The investment for this movie has already exceeded $100 million, and the post-production progress is more than 40%. If you want to go back to the drawing board, you might as well shoot me with Arnold's gun. Cameron was embarrassed for a moment, then he said unwillingly, Eric, it's just a very small modification. I swear to God, it won't cost much. Jim, this is not a matter of money. Otherwise, I would have fired you before you exceeded the budget by $100 million. The key is the schedule. Firefly has already started to promote Terminator 2, and I've already seen the rough cut of the movie. This movie is good enough. I just hope that you can produce it on time. Cameron continued to talk to Eric for a long time, but when he saw that Eric refused to budge, he left in disappointment. He definitely won't let this go, Stan Winston, who knew Cameron very well, said to Eric as he watched him leave. Eric had already changed into a relaxed expression and said, Of course I know he won't let this go, but this guy is used to pushing his luck, so I didn't dare to agree directly. Just keep an eye on him for me. If he needs to modify some details, just cooperate as much as possible, but you can't change your attitude of opposition. Stan Winston laughed. Eric, Jim always secretly complains that you're a movie businessman who doesn't wake up early without benefits. You're so young, but you only have money in your eyes and no dreams. If he heard what you just said, he would definitely change his opinion of you. Then it's better not to let him know. Eric also laughed. Otherwise, he'll only spend more of my money. Stan Winston laughed a few more times before saying, Let's get down to business, Eric. Although the CG special effects problem has been solved, I think it's not easy to perfectly combine the CG images with the real scene. This is also one of the reasons I came here today. In addition to checking the results of the special effects production, I also hope that you can bring a team with me to Oklahoma to do a field test for the movie. I need professional special effects artists to do the relevant assessment on the spot. Stan Winston thought about his recent work arrangements. After the establishment of Digital Domain, the company had received several business deals from other film companies, but these didn't need to be personally handled by Stan, so he nodded and agreed. Then I'll bring Matt and the others. To be honest, I suddenly feel that what you said might be right. In the near future, CG special effects may very well replace CG special effects. There's no need to be sad, Stan. It's just like how sound replaces silence and color replaces black and white in movies. These things are inevitable. Stan Winston said, I'm just a little emotional. Before this, I never thought that the CG special effects that I've been working on for more than 10 years would suddenly be replaced one day. Okay, let's not talk about this. When do you plan to leave? I'll make some preparations. We'll leave in 2 days. I'll get my assistant to fax you the specific itinerary. Actually, Conjing's team has already brought back a large number of videos and pictures. I've already selected some of the main shooting locations. This time, we're going to explore the feasibility of the specific shooting. We'll be back in about a week. Near noon, Eric declined Stan Winston's lunch invitation and hurriedly left Digital Domain's headquarters to drive to Beverly Hills. The car stopped outside a mansion in Beverly Hills. The driver got out and pressed the doorbell. The mansion's security guards quickly opened the door and the car drove straight in. Eric got out of the car and looked around. The mansion covered an area of about 1,000 square meters. A cobblestone corridor led directly to the entrance of the mansion. There were neat lawns on both sides, and there was a half-moon swimming pool in front of the mansion. Neither of the women came out to greet him, and Eric didn't mind. He pushed open the door of the mansion and walked in. As soon as he stepped into the living room, he heard a baby crying in the room on the left. He walked over and saw a funny scene in the baby's room. Elizabeth was holding a bell toy in her hand and shaking it non-stop. She was mumbling and making funny faces at the baby. Julia was holding the baby in her arms and trying to feed the baby with a milk bottle in her other hand. Seeing a figure appear at the door, the two women were delighted. However, when they realized that it was Eric, they didn't have time to be disappointed. They turned their attention to the child. Eric walked over and looked at the two women who were flustered. He reached out his hand and said, "Let me do it. The child's body is so delicate. How can you carry him like this?" Julia looked at Eric's serious expression and handed the baby over. Eric took the baby from Julia and held the back of the baby's head in his arms. He looked at the two women and asked, "Didn't you hire a nanny?" Julia looked at the baby who still didn't stop crying in Eric's arms and explained, "We hired two. Lena is on sick leave, and Betty went to the supermarket to buy milk powder for Emma. I don't know why she hasn't returned yet. Who knew that the little one would suddenly cry like this? Is she hungry?" Eric took the milk bottle from Julia's hand and put it in his mouth to test the temperature. He then put it close to the little girl's mouth. However, the little girl only smacked her lips twice before spitting out the pacifier and crying again. After returning the milk bottle to Julia, Eric lowered his head and sniffed it before saying, "It's time to change the diaper." With that said, Eric placed the baby in the stroller next to him. He opened the swaddling clothes, took off the wet diaper, and threw it aside. He reached out for a clean diaper next to him and skillfully wrapped the little one up. Elizabeth and Julia watched Eric change the baby's diaper with strange expressions on their faces. After Eric changed the baby's diaper and walked into the bathroom to wash his hands, the little one had already quieted down. She looked around with her bright eyes. Julia looked at Eric, who had just walked out, and couldn't help but say, "It's hard to imagine. What can't you do?" Eric stretched out a finger and carefully coaxed the little one. When he heard Julia's words, he smiled and said, "I also want to know the answer to this question. Let me know when you find out." Elizabeth, who was next to Julia, chimed in, "You won't give birth, right? It's not impossible for a man to be more ruthless to himself." Eric shrugged. "But I will never do that." Chapter 4:11. After having lunch at Julia's house, Julia and the nanny took care of the little guy while Eric and Elizabeth went upstairs to the study. After laying out the prepared information in front of the woman, Eric took out a box of videos and brought it to the VCR. Elizabeth opened the information brought by Eric and looked at it. It was roughly the Hollywood comedy genre and the box office of various types of comedies in recent years. As she picked it up and read it casually, Elizabeth heard a sound coming from the TV. She looked up and saw an actor with a rather exaggerated facial expression talking to a girl. However, it didn't take long for the scene to cut to another completely different scene, but it was still the same person. Looking at the actor's exaggerated teeth from time to time and listening to the funny dialogue coming from the TV, Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. Eric turned to the girl and said, "Isn't it interesting?" Elizabeth looked at the man in the picture doing an exaggerated twisting motion and said, "Well, who is this? Why don't I remember him before?" "His name is Jim Carrey. He has acted in a few small movies. Last year, he played a small role in a TV comedy on Fox TV. What you see is just the effect after he restrains his performance," Eric said and pressed the fast-forward button. Soon, the scene turned to an audition room. Jim Carrey was performing a mime show this time. He didn't make a sound at all, but his facial expression and body language were more exaggerated. It could even be said that he was crazy. "Do you think of anyone?" Eric asked again. Elizabeth held her chin and said quickly, "Chaplin?" "Yes, Chaplin. I feel that Jim Carrey's comedy talent is no less than Chaplin's." Eric rewound the video and replayed it. He got up and returned to Elizabeth's side. He picked up the information and said, "In recent years, Hollywood comedies are mainly romantic comedies and family comedies. The most successful ones are When Harry Met Sally and the 1987 box office champion Three Stay-at-Home Dads. Home Alone can also be classified as a family comedy, but it is more focused on children's audiences. It can also be said that it is a children's comedy. Other than that, there are very few outstanding works in other comedy genres, and the studio doesn't dare to boldly try other genres. So this is a very good opportunity. You can see it from last year's Fighting Condors. Comedies with a little more energy are very popular." Elizabeth asked curiously, "What's a comedy with more energy?" "It's a comedy with parody and vulgarity as its selling point. The main characteristic of these comedies is that they are exaggerated, and the plot goes against or beyond people's common sense, just like Condor Anti." Elizabeth picked up the documents in front of her and started reading again. Eric did not disturb her. He found a magazine and sat there, minding his own business. Those documents were prepared by him. He had read them several times before, and a lot of the data was already in his mind. There was no need for him to read them again. After a while, Elizabeth finished reading the statistics and said, "These statistics show that in the past 10 years, parodies and vulgar comedies have only accounted for 3% of the total box office sales. Moreover, these types of comedies are mostly limited to North America. Now that the overseas box office sales are getting bigger and bigger, these types of comedies don't seem to have much of a future. That's why I said that this is a big untapped gold mine. It seems that there's no future because everyone doesn't pay attention to this market." Elizabeth was very smart. She quickly realized something and said, "You're not using my TG as cannon fodder to test the waters for these types of comedies, are you?" Eric nodded. "You can put it that way. However, with me around, you won't be at a disadvantage. Jim Carrey was personally selected by me for you. This guy is still a nameless pawn. As long as I show up, I can easily sign him with an option contract for at least 3 years. The so-called option contract was a kind of restrictive contract that a film company signed with a newcomer when they were optimistic about a project. It stipulated that if a newcomer wanted to get a role, they had to sign additional conditions. Usually, these conditions were related to the sequel of the project. There were also requirements for the actor to act in the company's movie within a certain period of time, or to sign a contract for another movie at a low price. At Drew's birthday party, after Eric suggested that TG be in charge of comedy production, Elizabeth had already thought about it in detail. Although she habitually bickered with Eric on the surface, she also felt that what Eric said made sense. Instead of randomly choosing a project to produce a movie, it was better to focus on a theme. Comedy was undoubtedly a genre with a lot of potential. With Eric's help, she believed that TG would be able to produce good results in this area. Eric, then, what about the distribution? Elizabeth blinked and pretended to be relaxed as she asked. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you," Eric said with a smile. He knew that Elizabeth was definitely the kind of woman who cared about her family. She would always think about her family when it came to benefits. In Eric's opinion, this was a very good quality. The current ownership structure of TG remained unchanged. Elizabeth owned 40%, while Drew and Julia each owned 30%. The little girl was like his clone, so it was almost equivalent to him owning 30%. In addition to the following conditions, Eric would be able to take away more than half of TG's profits. Since he was using someone else's daughter as his coolie, he couldn't possibly take all the benefits. Moreover, the market was so big that it was impossible to do so. "I won't interfere with the investment. As for distribution, Firefly will distribute it locally in North America and videotape. The overseas distribution can be given to Fox. Elizabeth said, "Actually, we can do the distribution ourselves." Eric shook his head and said, "There's no need. I won't let you lose out anyway. TG just needs to focus on producing. With Firefly and Fox as our backing, TG will never encounter any problems in terms of discovery." Elizabeth retorted unwillingly, "I don't want to be a vassal. You've said before that a pure production company has no future. That's because they don't have enough backing. So, it's decided. No more bargaining. Let's discuss some more specific matters." Chapter 4:12. Elizabeth looked at Eric's non-negotiable expression and wrinkled her nose unwillingly, but she still nodded with a light snort. Eric showed a satisfied smile. Although this girl was used to being stubborn, she was becoming more and more docile. This was a good sign. Then the two began to discuss the specific cooperation plan. Unknowingly, the afternoon passed. Elizabeth looked at the gradually darkening sky outside the window. She put down the notebook in her hand and said, "It's not early anymore." Eric also turned his head and glanced at it. He nodded and said, "Well, it's okay. It's not dark yet. I've been busy all afternoon. You won't kick me out without eating, right?" "I'm afraid you'll eat something else after dinner." Elizabeth blurted out in dissatisfaction, but she immediately regretted it. Her face turned red, and she stood up in a panic. I'll go ask Julia to prepare your dinner." Looking at the girl's back as she ran away, Eric smiled, got up, stretched, and moved his muscles. He tidied up the scattered documents on the desk, walked to the sofa, and comfortably picked up the remote control to turn on the TV. He casually watched a Warner Cable TV movie. The sky was completely dark. There was a gentle knock on the door. Julia stood at the door and said, "Eric, it's time to eat." "I'll be right there." Eric turned off the TV, stood up, and walked out of the study. There was already a sumptuous dinner in the dining room. Eric pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at Julia, who was dividing the dinner for the two, and asked, "By the way, are you really going to give the little one that name?" "What?" Elizabeth was a little confused. Eric said, "Drew told me that you're going to name the little one Emma Roberts Murdoch." When Julia heard this, she looked at Elizabeth nervously. Elizabeth might have misunderstood Eric's meaning. She glared at Eric and said, "So what?" "Anyway, don't even think about it." Eric asked rhetorically. "Don't think about what?" Elizabeth said, Don't even think about adding Williams to her name. Emma is my and Julia's baby." Eric picked up the cutlery indifferently and cut the sausage in front of him. "I never thought about it. It's not like it's my child. I'm curious. If this matter is exposed, how are you going to explain it to your father? Are you going to tell him that you've come out of the closet?" "That's none of your business," Elizabeth said weakly. Eric shrugged and lowered his head to deal with the dinner in front of him. After dinner, Elizabeth consciously began to clean up the table like a docile little wife. Elizabeth went to the nursery to see the little guy under the care of the nanny, and then ran to a small living room in the villa to watch TV. Eric didn't move. He sat in the dining room connected to the kitchen and watched Julia clean up the cutlery. He asked, "With Emma, you definitely won't be able to take on any movies in the short term, right?" Julia scrubbed a plate with a plastic ball and said softly, "Anyway, the money I have is enough for me to use for a long time. At least until Emma is 1 year old, then I'll start working again. If it really doesn't work, then I'll be a producer with Liz. I think you're more suitable to be an actress. Actually, I have a few ideas that are suitable for you." Julia glanced at Eric and said, "You're always bullying me. I don't want to work with you anymore." Eric sighed exaggeratedly. "Can't you change the image of me as a demon king in your heart?" "Demon king." Julia repeated Eric's words and chuckled. "You really know yourself." Eric also smiled and looked at the girl not far away. The March night in Los Angeles was still very cold. Julia was wearing a light yellow close-fitting sweater and a pair of white casual pants that accentuated her slender and straight legs. The sweater seemed to be a little short. As the girl bent over, her slender waist was exposed from time to time, giving off a faint sexy aura. Sensing that Eric was looking at her without restraint, Julia cleaned the cutlery faster, as if she wanted to escape from Eric's sight as soon as possible. However, she soon found that Eric stood up and walked over to her. Julia subconsciously wanted to escape, but she realized that she was like a rabbit that had fallen into a trap. After a while, Julia said, "Eric, you'll be seen." Eric didn't mind being seen by Elizabeth, but he remembered that there was a nanny watching over Emma in the villa. If she found out, she would sign a confidentiality agreement in time, and it wouldn't be leaked. However, it would still be awkward. Thinking of this, Eric stopped. However, he still whispered in Julia's ear, "I'll take Liz back to her room first." Julia's little head was in a daze, and she subconsciously nodded obediently. It wasn't until Eric left the kitchen that Julia understood what Eric meant. Her face flushed, and she regretted agreeing to it. What should she do later? She walked to the kitchen door uneasily and looked out. She immediately saw Eric's figure walking upstairs. At the same time, she also saw Elizabeth. For some reason, Julia couldn't help but laugh when she saw Elizabeth. After washing the dishes, Julia and the nanny looked after Emma for a while. After dawdling for half an hour, they left the baby's room and headed upstairs to the bedroom. The morning sun shone into the bedroom through the curtains. Eric dreamed that he was submerged in a cold river. He opened his eyes while shivering, only to find that he was squeezed to the edge of the bed, and the blanket on his body had disappeared. Since he was already awake, Eric couldn't continue sleeping. He got dressed and left the bedroom. When he walked downstairs, he bumped into the slightly plump nanny who was about 30 years old. She was holding a milk bottle in her hand. Eric vaguely remembered that Julia called her Betty, so he greeted her. The Latina nanny named Betty was very clear about Eric's identity. She greeted him politely. Although she was curious about which mistress room Eric spent the night in, she didn't show any unusual expression on her face. Eric followed Betty into the baby's room. The little guy was lying on the bed, looking around curiously with his pair of beautiful eyes. When he saw Eric, he opened his mouth and giggled a few times, waving his little hands around. Eric noticed the nanny's tired face and said, "Miss Betty, let me feed the little guy. You can rest for a while." "It's okay, Mr. Williams. Someone will come to change shifts with me at 8. Didn't you say the other one was sick?" Eric asked as he reached out his hand to Betty. Seeing that Eric insisted, Betty handed the milk bottle over and explained, "Ms. Robert hired another one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to handle it." Seeing that Eric was feeding the little guy, Betty nonchalantly walked to the side and tidied up the diapers the little guy made last night. However, she couldn't help but look at Eric a few more times. Looking at how familiar Eric was, she couldn't help but wonder if this little guy was Julia's illegitimate daughter and was just pretending to be Julia's daughter. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.